The blizzard howled through Willow Creek Valley like a wounded beast, relentless and merciless. Snow blanketed the landscape in thick, suffocating layers, transforming the familiar terrain into something alien and hostile. In the midst of this white fury, a solitary figure struggled against the elements, his slight frame nearly lost in the swirling tempest. Nathaniel Reed pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, the fabric offering little protection against the biting cold. The wind cut through him like a knife, but he pressed forward, each step a battle against nature itself. His eyes, narrowed against the stinging snow, remained fixed on the barn, where Hudson, his prized bull, had been trapped when the storm hit. "Hold on, old friend," he muttered, the words immediately snatched away by the wind. Nathaniel's boots crunched through the fresh powder, sinking deeper with each step. His ranch, modest but meticulously maintained, had been his sanctuary for 5 years now. 5 years since he'd left behind the blood and screams of the battlefield. 5 years since he'd buried Sarah and their unborn child. The barn door had frozen shut, and Nathaniel threw his weight against it once, twice, before it finally gave way with a groan. Inside, the air was marginally warmer, thick with the smell of hay and livestock. His lantern cast eerie shadows across the interior as he moved toward the far stall. "Hudson," a distressed bellow answered him. The massive bull was trapped, half buried in snow that had collapsed through a section of the roof. The animal's dark eyes rolled with fear, his powerful body struggling against the weight pinning him down. Nathaniel assessed the situation quickly, the doctor in him calculating, analyzing. Hudson wasn't injured, not yet, but if he remained trapped in the cold for much longer— "Easy, boy, I'm going to get you out." He set the lantern on a nearby hook and began to dig, his small hands quickly growing numb despite his gloves. The snow had formed a heavy, compacted mass around the bull's hindquarters, unyielding despite Nathaniel's efforts. After 20 minutes of furious digging, he'd barely made progress. His breath came in ragged gasps, forming clouds in the frigid air. Hudson bellowed again, more urgently this time. I know, Nathaniel muttered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "I'm trying." The crack of splintering wood made him look up sharply. Another section of the roof was giving way under the weight of accumulated snow. If it collapsed, both he and Hudson would be buried. Desperation gave him renewed strength. Nathaniel grabbed a shovel and attacked the snow with fervor, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. Hudson's massive body was simply too heavy, the snow too densely packed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered until a booming voice called out from the barn entrance. "Reed, you in there?" Victor Blackwood's imposing silhouette filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly spanning the width of the entrance. Behind him, 2 of his ranch hands peered curiously into the dimness. "The barn's collapsing," Nathaniel called back, not pausing in his efforts. "Hudson's trapped." Blackwood strode forward, assessing the situation with a quick glance. His weathered face, half hidden beneath a thick beard, betrayed nothing as he looked from the struggling bull to Nathaniel's slight frame. "Step aside," he said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a suggestion. "This needs a man's strength." The words stung as they were intended to. Nathaniel had heard variations of the same sentiment countless times since settling in Willow Creek Valley. Too small, too bookish, not enough of a man to work the land properly. But Hudson's life was at stake. Swallowing his pride, Nathaniel moved back, allowing Blackwood and his men to take over. They made short work of the task, their combined strength accomplishing in minutes what Nathaniel had struggled with for nearly half an hour. Hudson staggered to his feet, shaking off the remaining snow with an indignant snort. The bull seemed unharmed, if disgruntled, by his ordeal. "Thank you," Nathaniel said stiffly, reaching for Hudson's lead rope. "I appreciate the help." Blackwood's laugh held no warmth. "Help? We just saved your prize bull, Doc. That beast is worth more than this entire sorry excuse for a ranch." He looked around the barn with undisguised contempt. "Though I don't know why you bother keeping him. Animal like that needs a real rancher." One of the ranch hands sniggered quickly, disguising it as a cough, when Nathaniel's gaze shifted to him. "Nevertheless, I'm grateful," Nathaniel said, his voice level, despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Would you like to come to the house for coffee? It's the least I can offer in this weather." "We've got actual work waiting," Blackwood replied, already turning toward the door. "Unlike some folks who play at being ranchers." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You know my offer stands, Reed. Sell this place to someone who knows what to do with it, before you lose everything." Then they were gone, leaving Nathaniel alone with Hudson in the howling wind that found its way through the damaged roof. "Don't you listen to him," Nathaniel murmured, stroking the bull's massive neck. "We're doing just fine." But as he secured Hudson in a sturdier stall and made his way back toward the house, Blackwood's words echoed in his mind. The truth was, maintaining the ranch alone was becoming increasingly difficult. The endless physical labor left him exhausted, and despite his medical knowledge and careful planning, He was just one small man against the unforgiving demands of frontier life. Inside the modest cabin, Nathaniel built up the fire and removed his wet outer clothes. The storm showed no signs of abating its fury, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every crack. As he warmed his hands by the flames, his gaze drifted to Sarah's rocking chair, still positioned by the window where she had loved to sit. The emptiness of the house seemed to press in around him, as tangible as the cold. 5 years of solitude, of speaking to no one but his livestock and the occasional patient who sought his medical expertise. 5 years of cooking for one, eating alone, sleeping in a bed that felt too large without her beside him. On impulse, Nathaniel crossed to his desk and withdrew a sheet of paper. The territorial newspaper sat nearby, folded open to the advertisements section. His eyes had been drawn repeatedly to the same column over the past weeks: mail-order brides and matrimonial opportunities. Men like him, widowers, bachelors, lonely souls carving out existences in remote places, seeking companionship in the only way available to them in these vast, sparsely populated territories. Nathaniel dipped his pen in ink and began to write, his precise handwriting filling the page. Honest rancher and physician seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures, quiet evenings, and the healing properties of both medicine and nature. Respectful partnership offered by educated widower of 35 years. He read it over twice, almost crumpling it on the third reading. The words seemed simultaneously too revealing and not revealing enough. What woman would respond to such an advertisement? Who would willingly choose a life of hardship in this remote valley with a man they'd never met? Yet the alternative, continuing this solitary existence indefinitely, suddenly seemed unbearable. Perhaps it was Blackwood's mockery, or the near loss of Hudson, or simply the howling emptiness of the storm that matched the void in his own life. Whatever the reason, Nathaniel folded the letter, carefully addressed an envelope to the newspaper office, and set it aside to be mailed when the weather cleared. That night, as the blizzard raged on, he dreamed of Sarah. Not the Sarah of their final days, pale and struggling with a difficult pregnancy, but the vibrant young woman who had first captured his heart with her knowledge of medicinal plants and her unwavering belief in his abilities as a doctor. "You deserve happiness," dreamed Sarah told him, her hand cool against his cheek. "Don't be afraid to seek it." He woke with tears on his face and her name on his lips. Spring came to Willow Creek Valley in fits and starts, winter reluctantly loosening its grip on the land. Nathaniel found himself watching for the mail carrier with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. 2 weeks after sending his advertisement, the first response arrived. The letter was written in a bold, decisive hand, the pressure of the pen leaving slight indentations on the reverse side of the paper. Unlike the flowing script he'd expected from a potential bride, this writing was strong, almost masculine in its straightforwardness. "Dr. Reed," it began without preamble, "your advertisement spoke of medicine and nature as having healing properties, a sentiment with which I wholeheartedly agree. I too have found solace in the natural world and its remedies when human comfort was scarce. I am responding to your notice because I seek a respectful partnership, as you described, with someone who values knowledge and quiet companionship over more frivolous attachments. I am 29 years old, in good health, and have experience with ranch work and livestock management. If these qualities interest you, I would welcome further correspondence. Sincerely, Eleanor Grace." Nathaniel read the letter 3 times, trying to form a picture of the woman behind the words. There was an intelligence in her phrasing, a directness he found refreshing after the often flowery language common in women's correspondence. Her mention of ranch work was unexpected, but promising a woman who understood the demands of his lifestyle would be less likely to flee back east when confronted with the realities of frontier living. He replied that same evening, and thus began a correspondence that would stretch over the next 3 months. Eleanor's letters revealed a woman of surprising depth and practical knowledge. She wrote of herbs and their medicinal properties, often suggesting combinations Nathaniel himself hadn't considered. She described techniques for calming nervous livestock, methods of predicting weather changes by observing animal behavior, and efficient approaches to managing a small ranch with minimal help. Never once did she mention her appearance, her family background, or her reasons for seeking a husband through an advertisement. Whenever Nathaniel gently probed these areas, Eleanor redirected the conversation to more practical matters. It was unusual, but he found himself more intrigued than concerned by her reticence. By the time wildflowers carpeted the valley floor, Nathaniel had made his decision. He sent Eleanor a formal proposal of marriage, along with funds for her journey west, should she accept. Her response was characteristically brief. "I accept your proposal and will arrive on the 3rd week of June. Please expect me on the afternoon stage to Willow Creek. Eleanor." With the date set, Nathaniel threw himself into preparations. The cabin, already meticulously maintained, was thoroughly cleaned. He constructed a new dresser for Eleanor's belongings, added shelves in the kitchen for her use, and expanded his small herb garden to include varieties she had mentioned in her letters. In the evenings by lamplight, he worked on a special gift, a wedding ring carved from the heartwood of an ancient oak that had fallen during the winter storms. The wood was dense and beautiful with rich grain patterns that emerged as he carefully shaped and polished it. Inside the ring, he created a hidden compartment, a small space sealed with a nearly invisible sliding panel. Within this secret space, he placed a tiny slip of paper bearing Sarah's name and the date of her passing. It wasn't that he intended to keep Sarah's memory a secret from Eleanor. He had mentioned his widow status in their correspondence. But the hidden name was a private acknowledgement, a way of carrying his past while still moving forward. The ring itself symbolized his hope for a new beginning. The night before Eleanor's scheduled arrival, Nathaniel sat by the fire, his completed ring in one hand, and Eleanor's letters spread before him on the table. Tomorrow, the abstract concept of a mail-order bride would become a flesh and blood woman with whom he would share his life. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. From the drawer of his desk, he withdrew a small daguerreotype in a silver frame, Sarah seated in her rocking chair, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. It had been taken just 3 weeks before their world had shattered. "I hope you understand," he whispered to the image. "It's been so long, and the silence in this house." He trailed off, uncertain what he was trying to justify or explain. Sarah, with her generous heart, would never have wanted him to spend his life alone. She had always been practical about such matters. Nathaniel carefully returned the photograph to its drawer. Tomorrow would bring change as a new chapter. He tucked the wooden ring into its box and placed it in his jacket pocket, where it would wait until the proper moment. Sleep came fitfully that night, his dreams a confused jumble of past and potential future. Sarah's face blended with the imagined features he'd assigned to Eleanor Petite, with gentle hands and a soft voice that would fill the silence of his lonely ranch. The stagecoach was late. Nathaniel paced the short length of Willow Creek's only street, checking his pocket watch for the dozenth time. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and he was beginning to regret his decision to wear his best suit, complete with stiff collar and wool vest. Sweat trickled down his back as he nodded greetings to townspeople who passed by their curious glances, making it clear they knew exactly what, or rather who, he was waiting for. News traveled fast in small communities, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was the most exciting event Willow Creek had seen in months. Several women from town had conveniently found reasons to be shopping at the general store, while a cluster of men loitered near the saloon, occasionally casting amused looks in Nathaniel's direction. "Nervous, Doc," called Samuel Jenkins the blacksmith, his grin visible beneath his bushy mustache. "Just concerned about the stage being late," Nathaniel replied, trying to keep his tone casual. "Unusual for them to be off schedule." Sure, Jenkins chuckled. "Nothing to do with meeting your missus for the first time." Before Nathaniel could respond, a shout went up from the edge of town. "Stage is coming." The distant rumble of wheels and the cloud of dust on the horizon confirmed it. Nathaniel took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and moved to stand near the stagecoach. "Stop." His heart hammered against his ribs as the vehicle grew larger, the team of 6 horses pulling it at a steady trot. The stagecoach rolled to a stop with a squeal of brakes and the jangling of harnesses. William Porter, who drove this route between larger settlements, set the brake and secured the reins before climbing down from his seat. "Afternoon, Doc." Porter greeted him, tipping his hat. "Got your special delivery right here." He winked as he moved to open the coach door. "Might be a bit different than you expected, though." Before Nathaniel could question this cryptic statement, Porter had swung the door open and extended his hand to assist the passenger within. A large hand gripped Porter's, and then to Nathaniel's absolute astonishment, the tallest woman he had ever seen ducked through the doorway and stepped down onto the dusty street. Eleanor Grace stood a full 6 feet tall in her worn boots with shoulders broader than most men in town. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid that hung to the middle of her back. She wore a simple traveling dress of sturdy cotton, unadorned, except for a small brooch at her collar. Her face was tanned from outdoor work, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that some might call handsome rather than pretty. But it was her eyes that truly captured Nathaniel's attention, clear gray, intelligent, and watchful. They took in everything, including his obvious shock, with an expression that suggested she had anticipated exactly this reaction. For a moment, neither spoke. The townsfolk had fallen into a stunned silence, broken only by someone's poorly suppressed snicker. Nathaniel was acutely aware of how he must appear to her, barely reaching her shoulder, slight of build, and currently gaping like a fish out of water. Eleanor was the first to recover. She stepped forward and extended her hand, not in the delicate manner of a lady expecting her fingers to be kissed, but directly as one might in a business transaction. "Dr. Reed, I presume," she said, her voice deeper than he had imagined, but not unkind. I'm Eleanor Grace. Your letters didn't mention you were small, he supplied, finding his voice at last as he took her offered hand. Her grip was firm but careful, as though she was conscious of her own strength. A hint of a smile touched her lips. I was going to say distinguished. Your letters didn't mention you were so distinguished. It was a gracious recovery, and Nathaniel felt a surge of gratitude for her tact. And yours didn't mention you were so large. Now there was definite amusement in her eyes, though her expression remained composed. Impressive, he finished, and meant it. Up close, there was something striking about Eleanor Grace. She carried herself with dignity, despite the whispers now circulating among the onlookers. Porter cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Got your trunk right here, Miss Grace. He gestured to the boot of the coach, where a single large trunk was secured with ropes. Need a hand with it? I can manage, Eleanor replied, already moving toward the back of the coach. Before either man could protest, she had untied the ropes and lifted the heavy trunk as though it weighed nothing, setting it down beside her. Where is your wagon, Doctor? Reed. This way, Nathaniel said, leading her toward the small buckboard he'd parked at the edge of town. And please call me Nathaniel. We are to be married after all. The words sounded strange to his own ears, almost absurd given the circumstances. This woman, this Amazon, was so far from the gentle, delicate bride he had imagined that the contrast was almost comical. Yet there was something in her direct gaze and the careful way she had handled their awkward introduction that gave him pause. Eleanor Grace might not be what he had expected, but there was a steadiness to her that he couldn't help but respect. Together they loaded her trunk onto the wagon, though in truth Eleanor did most of the lifting while Nathaniel directed. As they prepared to depart, he became aware that nearly the entire town had gathered to witness the spectacle. Martha Wilkins, the widow who owned the general store, was whispering furiously to her sister. Victor Blackwood stood among a group of ranchers, his expression a mixture of disbelief and malicious amusement. Well, Doc, Blackwood called out as Nathaniel helped Eleanor onto the wagon seat. Looks like you got yourself a fine workhorse instead of a wife. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel felt heat rise to his face, but before he could respond, Eleanor's voice cut through the mockery, clear and composed. I've always found that those who judge others by appearance alone reveal far more about themselves than about their targets. Mr. Blackwood. The man supplied his grin, faltering slightly. Victor Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor continued with a nod. I imagine a man of your wisdom, Yem, understands that true value lies in character rather than stature. Her gaze swept the gathered crowd before returning to Blackwood. Or perhaps not. The subtle rebuke left Blackwood momentarily speechless. Without waiting for his recovery, Eleanor turned to Nathaniel. Shall we proceed to your ranch? I'm eager to see my new home. Nathaniel climbed up beside her, acutely aware of the contrast they presented, her towering presence making his own frame seem even smaller by comparison. He took up the reins and set the horses in motion, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. They traveled in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves. The tension between them was palpable, a living thing that seemed to occupy the space on the seat between their bodies. I should have been more forthcoming in my letters, Eleanor said finally, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. About my stature. As should I, Nathaniel admitted, though I suspect my omission was less surprising than yours. A soft laugh escaped her, surprising them both. Perhaps, though I've learned that people tend to see what they expect to see. Your mind likely created an image of me that fit your preconceptions just as mine did for you. And what did you expect? Nathaniel asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor considered this for a moment. Someone older, I think, more weathered. Your letters showed such knowledge, such experience. I imagined gray at your temples at the very least. I'm sorry to disappoint. I didn't say I was disappointed, she replied, glancing at him briefly. Merely surprised. And you, Dr. Reed, are you disappointed? The directness of the question caught him off guard. Honesty seemed the only possible response. Surprised, certainly. As for disappointment, he weighed his words carefully. I think it would be premature to make such judgments before we've had a chance to become acquainted beyond letters and first impressions. Eleanor nodded, seemingly satisfied with this diplomatic answer. A reasonable approach. I appreciate your candor. They lapsed into silence again, but it felt less strained now. As they crested the hill that overlooked his property, Nathaniel felt a familiar pride mingled with apprehension. How would Eleanor see his modest ranch? Would she find it lacking as so many in town seemed to? There it is, he said, gesturing ahead. Reed Ranch. It's not large, but the land is good, and the creek provides reliable water even in dry years. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze intent as she took in the small cabin. The sturdy barn, the corral where Hudson stood watching their approach, and the neat rows of the vegetable garden beside the house. She studied everything with the careful assessment of someone who understood ranch work. "You've maintained it well," she said after a moment. "The roof on the barn is new." Nathaniel nodded, surprised by her observation. "Replaced it after the winter storms. Part of it collapsed during a blizzard. Good work on the supports. Cedar. Pine, actually. Cedar's hard to come by in these parts." Eleanor nodded again, her expression thoughtful. "The garden is well planned. Medicinal herbs on the south side where they'll get proper sun vegetables arranged by water needs. Sensible." Her approval expressed in such practical terms warmed Nathaniel more than effusive praise might have. She understood what she was seeing, valued the thought and care he'd put into his home. As they pulled up to the cabin, Hudson bellowed a greeting from the corral, his massive head raised in curiosity at the newcomer. "That's Hudson," Nathaniel explained as he set the brake. "Prize bull, though he's been more trouble than he's worth lately. Nearly got himself killed in that roof collapse I mentioned." Eleanor's eyes lit with interest. "Durham Shorthorn, he's magnificent. You know cattle breeds." "Among other things," she replied, already climbing down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. "May I?" At Nathaniel's nod, Eleanor approached the corral fence. Hudson, normally suspicious of strangers, watched her with unusual attentiveness. When she reached the fence, the bull ambled over, extending his great head toward her outstretched hand. "Hello, handsome," Eleanor murmured, her voice taking on a gentler tone than Nathaniel had yet heard from her. "Aren't you a fine specimen?" To Nathaniel's amazement, Hudson allowed her to stroke his broad forehead, even leaning into her touch like an oversized dog seeking affection. "He doesn't usually take to strangers," Nathaniel said, coming to stand beside her, "and especially not since the accident. He's been skittish, almost aggressive at times." Eleanor's fingers found a spot behind Hudson's left ear, and the bull's eyes half closed in evident pleasure. "Animals can sense fear and uncertainty," she said. "If you approach them with confidence and respect, they respond in kind." She glanced at Nathaniel. "People aren't so different in my experience." There was something in her tone that hinted at deeper meaning, but before Nathaniel could pursue it, Eleanor had turned her attention back to the house. "Shall we go inside? I'd like to get settled before dark." Together, they unloaded her trunk and carried it into the cabin. Nathaniel had spent the morning making final preparations, and the interior was spotlessly clean, with a small vase of wildflowers on the table and a fire laid ready in the hearth against the evening chill. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room, taking in the modest furnishings, the pine table and chairs, the bookshelves filled with medical texts and journals, the comfortable armchair beside the hearth, and Sarah's rocking chair still positioned by the window. "It's a good house," she said finally. "Solid construction, well maintained. You've created a proper home here, Nathaniel." "Thank you," he replied oddly, touched by her assessment. "It's not grand, but it suits my needs. I hope it will suit yours as well." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the rocking chair, and Nathaniel realized belatedly that he should have moved it, stored it away before her arrival. It stood as a silent monument to Sarah, to the life they had planned together. "Your late wife's?" Eleanor asked quietly. Nathaniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "What was her name?" "Sarah," he managed. "Her name was Sarah." Eleanor crossed to the chair and rested her hand lightly on its back, her touch respectful. "It's a beautiful piece, cherry wood." "Yes, I made it for her when we first came here." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're a woodworker as well as a doctor and rancher." "Just a hobby," Nathaniel said modestly. "But Sarah enjoyed rocking in the evenings while she read or sewed, so I wanted her to have a comfortable chair." Eleanor nodded, then moved away from the chair toward the kitchen area. "You mentioned in your letters that you're primarily a physician. Do you still practice?" Grateful for the change of subject, Nathaniel followed her. "In a limited capacity. The town has a younger doctor now for day-to-day concerns, but people still come to me for certain ailments. I've developed something of a reputation for treating conditions others consider hopeless, using herbal remedies. Among other approaches, I learned a great deal during the war about improvising treatments when conventional medicines weren't available." He hesitated, then added, "Your letters showed considerable knowledge of medicinal plants. Where did you study?" A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. "I didn't formally. My knowledge comes from practical experience and observation. I've always had an affinity for growing things." It was clearly a simplified answer, but Nathaniel didn't press. They had time to learn each other's stories. "I prepared the bedroom for you," he said, gesturing toward the door at the far end of the cabin. "I'll sleep out here until we determine more permanent arrangements." A faint flush colored Eleanor's cheeks, the first sign of self-consciousness she had displayed. "That's considerate of you. Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken questions and uncertainties. They were strangers, yet according to the agreement in their letters, they were to be husband and wife. The reality of the situation, its strangeness, its potential for either profound connection or bitter regret seemed suddenly overwhelming. Eleanor was the first to break the tension. I should unpack my things. And then if you're amenable, I'd like to see more of the ranch before sunset. It's important I understand the layout and daily operations if I'm to be of assistance. Of course, Nathaniel agreed, relieved by her practical approach. I'll start dinner while you settle in. Nothing fancy, I'm afraid, just venison stew and biscuits. That sounds perfect, Eleanor said, and for the first time since her arrival she offered a genuine smile. It transformed her face, softening the strong lines of her chin and bringing warmth to her watchful eyes. I haven't had a home-cooked meal in quite some time. As she disappeared into the bedroom with her trunk, Nathaniel found himself standing in the middle of his suddenly altered home, the wooden ring box, a solid weight in his pocket. Nothing about this day had gone as he'd imagined. The woman in his bedroom was so different from the bride he'd envisioned that the contrast was almost comical. Yet as he moved to the kitchen to begin preparing their meal, Nathaniel realized that beneath his shock and uncertainty, another emotion was stirring. Curiosity, perhaps, or something like hope. Eleanor Grace was a mystery, a woman of contradictions, strong yet careful, direct yet tactful, imposing in stature yet gentle with animals. The life they might build together would certainly not be what he had imagined. But as he chopped vegetables for the stew, Nathaniel found himself wondering if perhaps it might be something better, something neither of them could have created alone. Outside, the setting sun painted Willow Creek Valley in shades of gold and amber, the light catching on the creek that gave the valley its name. A new chapter was beginning. What story it would tell remained to be written. The rain began just after midnight, a gentle patter against the roof that gradually intensified into a steady downpour. Nathaniel, dozing in the armchair by the dying fire, was jerked awake by a tremendous crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. For a moment he was disoriented, uncertain why he was sleeping in the chair rather than his bed. Then memory returned. Eleanor Grace, his mail-order bride with her surprising stature and watchful eyes, was currently occupying his bedroom. Their evening together had been quietly companionable. After showing Eleanor around the ranch, during which she had asked intelligent, practical questions about water sources, grazing rotations, and winter preparations, they had shared the simple dinner. Conversation had flowed more easily than Nathaniel had expected, focusing primarily on the management of the ranch and his occasional medical practice. Eleanor had proven herself both knowledgeable and observant, often anticipating his explanations with insights of her own. They had carefully avoided more personal topics, an unspoken agreement to establish a foundation of mutual respect before venturing into deeper waters. Now, as another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin interior, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap, Nathaniel rose from the chair. Storms like this could be dangerous, especially with the ground already saturated from earlier spring rains. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Rain lashed against the glass, driven by gusting winds that bent the trees along the creek. The water level was already rising, the normally placid stream transforming into a churning, angry current. Trouble. Nathaniel turned to find Eleanor standing in the bedroom doorway, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She had changed into a simple nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, but there was nothing vulnerable about her posture. She looked alert, ready for action. The creek's rising faster than I've seen before, Nathaniel explained, turning back to the window. If it floods, the lower pasture could be underwater by morning. Eleanor joined him at the window, her greater height allowing her to see over his head without difficulty. The livestock, most are in the upper pasture, but Hudson is in the corral near the barn. Nathaniel frowned, calculating distances and water levels. If the creek overflows its banks at the bend, the corral would be directly in its path, Eleanor finished for him. She was already moving toward the door where her boots stood. We should move him to higher ground. Nathaniel couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Eleanor, you just arrived after days of travel. This isn't your responsibility. She paused in the act of pulling on her boots to give him a level look. I agreed to be your wife, Nathaniel. That makes the welfare of this ranch my responsibility as much as yours. Before he could respond, she had shrugged off the quilt and was reaching for her coat. Besides, Hudson seemed to like me. He might be more cooperative with both of us. There was no arguing with her logic or her determination. Within minutes, they were both dressed and heading toward the barn lanterns held high against the darkness. The rain was relentless, soaking them despite their coats and hats. By the time they reached the corral, the water from the creek had already begun to spread across the lower ground, inching toward where Hudson stood, his massive form huddled against the far fence. He's frightened, Eleanor observed, her voice raised to be heard above the storm. See how he's holding his head? Nathaniel nodded, approaching the gate carefully. Hudson, easy, boy. The bull snorted, pawing at the increasingly muddy ground, but making no move toward them. I'll need to go in and get him, Nathaniel said, already unlatching the gate. If you could hold the lantern higher. Wait, Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. Let me try first. He responded well to me earlier. Before Nathaniel could protest, she had slipped through the gate and was moving toward Hudson with slow, deliberate steps. The rain plastered her clothing to her body, highlighting the strong lines of her shoulders and back as she advanced, speaking to the bull in a low, steady voice that barely carried to where Nathaniel stood. Easy, handsome. It's just water, nothing to fear. We're going to move you somewhere dry and safe, but you need to trust me. To Nathaniel's amazement, Hudson's aggressive posture gradually relaxed. His massive head lowered slightly and the pawing stopped. When Eleanor reached him, the bull allowed her to stroke his neck and face without protest. That's it, she murmured. Good boy. Such a brave, strong fellow. Hudson actually leaned into her touch as though drawing comfort from her presence. With careful movements, Eleanor fastened a lead rope to his halter and began to guide him toward the gate, still speaking in that same soothing tone. Nathaniel held the gate open, his admiration growing as Eleanor led the normally temperamental bull through without incident. Together, they guided Hudson up the slope toward the barn, where a dry stall awaited him. Once inside, Eleanor efficiently settled the bull with fresh hay and water, while Nathaniel secured the barn doors against the wind. When he turned back, he found her examining Hudson more closely, her hands moving with professional competence over the animal's hide. Is something wrong? He asked, moving to join her. Eleanor's expression was troubled. I'm not certain. His breathing seems labored, and there's a tremor in his muscles that isn't explained by cold or fear. Her fingers probed gently at Hudson's neck and jaw. Has he been eating normally? Any changes in behavior beyond the skittishness you mentioned? Nathaniel considered this, trying to recall Hudson's patterns over the past days. Now that you mention it, he hasn't been finishing his feed, which is unusual, and he's been more aggressive with the other livestock, especially near the water trough. Eleanor nodded, her suspicions apparently confirmed. I think he may have been poisoned. Poisoned? Nathaniel repeated, shocked. That's impossible. Who would? Not who, Eleanor interrupted. What? Has he had access to any unfamiliar plants, particularly around the water sources? Understanding dawned. There was a slide near the upper creek after the last heavy rain. It exposed some new growth I didn't recognize. I meant to investigate, but got distracted with preparations for your arrival. Show me tomorrow when it's light, Eleanor said decisively. For now, we need to help him flush the toxins from his system. She thought for a moment. Do you have activated charcoal in your medical supplies? And perhaps milk thistle or dandelion root? Nathaniel nodded, impressed by her quick diagnosis and treatment plan. In my office. I'll get them. I'll stay with him, Eleanor said, already pulling up a stool beside the stall. He seems calmer when someone's nearby. By the time Nathaniel returned with the requested items, the storm had intensified further. The barn roof, recently repaired after the winter damage, creaked ominously under the assault of wind and rain. Together, they prepared a mixture of crushed charcoal, herbs, and molasses to make it palatable. Eleanor held Hudson's head steady, while Nathaniel administered the concoction, using a long-necked bottle that allowed them to bypass the bull's teeth and place the medicine directly at the back of his tongue. There, Nathaniel said as they finished. That should help neutralize whatever he ingested. We'll need to monitor him through the night, though. Eleanor nodded, her expression serious as she stroked Hudson's damp coat. I can take the first watch if you'd like to rest. That's not necessary, Nathaniel began, but a tremendous crash from outside interrupted him. They both rushed to the barn door and peered out into the stormy darkness. What they saw made Nathaniel's heart sink. The creek had indeed overflowed its banks, and a surge of water was now racing across the lower pasture. Worse, it had uprooted a massive old tree that had stood near the bend. The tree, carried by the floodwaters, had slammed into the small dam Nathaniel had built to create a pond for irrigation during dry months. The dam won't hold, he said grimly. If it breaks completely, the water will take out the bridge to town and possibly flood the root cellar where I store medicines and winter supplies. Eleanor was already pulling her coat tighter around her. What do we do? The automatic inclusion of herself in his problems touched Nathaniel deeply. They had known each other less than a day, yet here she stood ready to face a dangerous storm at his side. We need to reinforce the dam, or at least create a secondary barrier to divert the worst of the flow away from the buildings, he explained, raising his voice as the wind howled around them. There's lumber in the storage shed and sandbags I prepared after the last flood. If we can position them strategically. Lead the way, Eleanor said simply. What followed was a battle against nature itself. The rain continued relentlessly as they worked to position lumber and sandbags along the creek bank. The water was bitingly cold, the current strong enough to make wading dangerous. Mud sucked at their boots, threatening to topple them with each step. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a task for several strong men. But Eleanor's strength proved invaluable. She could carry twice the load Nathaniel could manage, wading into deeper sections where his smaller frame would have been swept away. They worked in tandem, communicating with shouted instructions and gestures when the storm's fury made words impossible. At one point, a sudden surge in the current knocked Nathaniel off his feet. Before he could be swept downstream, Eleanor's strong hand clamped around his wrist, hauling him upright with seemingly effortless strength. "Careful," she shouted over the storm. "I've only just met you. I'm not ready to become a widow so soon." Despite the dire circumstances, Nathaniel found himself laughing, a brief, breathless sound of genuine amusement. There was something both absurd and wonderful about their situation, soaked to the skin, covered in mud, fighting a flood alongside a woman he barely knew, but who was at least on paper his intended wife. By dawn, the rain had finally begun to ease. They had managed to divert the worst of the flooding away from the buildings, though the lower pasture was now a shallow lake. Exhausted, mud-splattered, and chilled to the bone, they made their way back to the barn to check on Hudson. The bull greeted them with a soft bellow that sounded almost welcoming. To Nathaniel's experienced eye, Hudson already looked improved, his breathing more regular, the tremor in his muscles less pronounced. "The treatment seems to be working," he observed, relief evident in his voice. "Another dose in a few hours should complete the process." Eleanor nodded, fatigue finally showing in the slump of her shoulders and the pallor beneath her tanned skin. "Good, he's a fine animal. It would be a shame to lose him." Nathaniel studied her as she leaned against the stall door. Wet hair plastered to her neck, clothes sodden and mud-stained. She had worked through the night without complaint, matching and often exceeding his own efforts. Without her help, he might well have lost the bridge, and possibly Hudson as well. "Thank you," he said simply. "I couldn't have managed without you." Eleanor straightened, seeming almost embarrassed by his gratitude. "It's what anyone would have done." "No," Nathaniel corrected her gently. "It's not what anyone would have done. It's what a partner does. And you've proven yourself a remarkable one." A faint flush colored her cheeks, visible even through the mud and exhaustion. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. "We should get back to the house," she said finally. "Get dry and warm before checking the rest of the property." As they trudged back toward the cabin, the rising sun breaking through the clouds to cast long shadows across the flooded pasture, Nathaniel was struck by how quickly life could change. Yesterday morning, he had been a solitary man, awaiting the arrival of an unknown bride. Now he was walking beside a woman who had already proven her worth in ways he could never have anticipated. Eleanor Grace was not the wife he had imagined. She was perhaps something far better, a true partner for the unpredictable life he had chosen in this beautiful, harsh valley. In his pocket, the wooden ring seemed to warm against his skin, as if reminding him of its presence. Not yet, he thought, but soon. The time wasn't right for formal proposals or declarations. But as they reached the cabin, leaving muddy boots by the door, and moving in companionable silence to prepare coffee and dry clothing, Nathaniel felt the first stirrings of something he had not expected to feel again. Hope mixed with a sense of possibility that had been absent from his life for far too long. Outside, the creek waters began their slow recession, revealing the changed landscape of Willow Creek Valley, altered but enduring, much like the two people who now shared the small cabin overlooking its winding path. The day after the flood dawned clear and warm, the sky washed clean of clouds. Nathaniel woke stiff and sore, his muscles protesting the night's labor. He had slept on the floor near the fireplace, insisting that Eleanor take his bed after their ordeal. Despite her protest that she was accustomed to discomfort, he had been firm. She was a guest in his home, bride-to-be or not, and deserved whatever comforts he could provide. Now, as he quietly stoked the fire and set coffee to boil, Nathaniel reflected on the remarkable events of the previous day. Eleanor's arrival had upended his expectations in every possible way, yet he couldn't deny a growing sense of admiration for the woman who had worked alongside him through the night, her strength and determination matching his own resolve. A soft creak of floorboards announced Eleanor's presence. She emerged from the bedroom dressed in a simple work shirt and sturdy trousers, her dark hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. The masculine attire should have looked odd on her, but somehow it suited her tall, strong frame better than the traveling dress she'd worn upon arrival. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "I hope I haven't overslept. There must be considerable work to do after last night's damage." "Nothing that can't wait until after breakfast," Nathaniel assured her, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. "You earned your rest." Eleanor accepted the coffee with a grateful nod, cradling the mug in hands that Nathaniel noticed were reddened and slightly swollen from the previous night's labor. Without comment, he opened a small jar on the mantelpiece and offered it to her. Arnica and comfrey salve, he explained, for the inflammation. Your hands must be painful. Surprise flickered across her features, followed by something like appreciation. Thank you, she said, taking a small amount and working it carefully into her skin. Most people don't notice such things. I'm a doctor, Nathaniel reminded her. Observation is essential to proper diagnosis. And is that what you're doing, doctor, diagnosing me? There was a hint of wariness in her tone, though her expression remained neutral. Nathaniel considered his response carefully. I observe by habit, not intention, but I've noticed you're someone who puts others' needs before your own discomfort. It's an admirable quality, though one that often leads to neglected self-care. Eleanor's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. An accurate assessment, I suppose. Though the same could be said of you. I saw you limping as you crossed to the fireplace, yet you insisted I take the comfortable bed. Touché, Nathaniel acknowledged with a small smile of his own. Perhaps we're more alike than our appearances would suggest. This earned him a genuine smile, transforming Eleanor's face and revealing a small dimple in her right cheek. Perhaps we are. They ate a simple breakfast of cornbread and dried apple preserves, discussing the day's necessary tasks. The lower pasture remained flooded, but the waters were receding. The bridge to town had survived, though it would need reinforcement. Hudson was showing signs of improvement, but would require continued treatment and monitoring. I'd like to see those plants you mentioned, Eleanor said as they finished their meal. The ones you thought Hudson might have eaten. If they're what I suspect, there could be danger to other livestock as well. Nathaniel nodded. We'll check on Hudson first, then I'll show you where the landslide occurred. As they walked to the barn, Nathaniel was struck by how quickly they had fallen into a rhythm of cooperation, as though they'd worked together for years rather than hours. There was an easy efficiency to their movements, a wordless understanding of what needed to be done and how best to accomplish it. Hudson greeted them with a rumbling bellow that sounded much stronger than the previous night. His eyes were clear, his stance steady as they entered the stall to examine him. The tremors have stopped, Eleanor observed, running her hands expertly along the bull's flanks. And his breathing is normal. Whatever he ingested, the treatment seems to have worked. Thanks to your quick diagnosis, Nathaniel said. I might have attributed his symptoms to fear or cold if you hadn't recognized the signs of poisoning. Eleanor shrugged, though he could see she was pleased by the acknowledgement. I've seen similar cases before. Certain plants become more potent after heavy rains, their toxins concentrated. Animals that would normally avoid them might ingest them accidentally, especially if they're washed into water sources. They administered another dose of the medicinal mixture, then led Hudson to a clean stall with fresh hay and water. The bull seemed content to remain in the barn for now, still recovering from his ordeal. Outside, the morning sun had begun to dry the mud from the previous night's flood, though the lower pasture remained submerged under several inches of water. Nathaniel led Eleanor along the creek to where the landslide had occurred, pointing out the exposed soil and new vegetation that had appeared afterward. Eleanor knelt to examine the plants, her fingers gently separating stems and leaves for closer inspection. Water hemlock, she said grimly, pointing to a cluster of white-flowered plants with purple-streaked stems. And here false hellebore, both highly toxic, especially to cattle. Nathaniel frowned, kneeling beside her. I should have recognized them. Careless of me. You had other concerns, Eleanor said mildly. Preparing for my arrival, managing the ranch alone. Even doctors can't be expected to notice everything. Her understanding eased his self-recrimination somewhat. Still, we'll need to clear this entire area and check all the water sources to ensure none of the plants were washed downstream. We should burn what we remove, Eleanor suggested. Even dead, these plants can remain toxic for some time. They spent the morning carefully uprooting the poisonous plants, placing them in burlap sacks to be burned later. It was painstaking work requiring careful attention to ensure no toxic roots or seeds remained in the soil. By midday, they were both sweating under the warm spring sun, their backs aching from the constant bending. Let's take a break, Nathaniel suggested, straightening with the winds. There's a shady spot by the creek just around that bend. We can rest and have some water. Eleanor nodded, brushing soil from her hands. As they walked, Nathaniel found himself studying her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows that suggested she was deep in thought. There was a grace to her movements, despite her size, a controlled power that reminded him of a well-trained cavalry horse. You have questions, she said suddenly without looking at him. I can feel you watching me. Nathaniel didn't bother to deny it. I do, but I'm not certain which ones I have the right to ask. They reached the shady spot, a small clearing beneath an ancient cottonwood tree that had survived the flood. Eleanor settled onto a flat rock, her long legs stretched before her. We are to be married, she pointed out. According to our agreement, at least. That would suggest you have the right to know who I am. Agreements can be reconsidered, Nathaniel said, taking a seat on a fallen log across from her, especially when circumstances change. I'm not the man you expected, and you're certainly not the woman I imagined. A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. If you wish to void our arrangement, I understand. I've been less than forthcoming about certain aspects of myself. As have I, Nathaniel admitted, but I'm not suggesting we end our agreement, only that perhaps we should renegotiate its terms with a clearer understanding of who we both are. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her gray eyes unreadable. Then with a decisive nod, she reached for the canteen at her belt and took a long drink before passing it to him. Ask your questions then, she said, and I'll answer as honestly as I can. Nathaniel accepted the canteen, considering where to begin. Your knowledge of livestock and ranching, it's professional, not merely incidental. Where did you learn it? My father's ranch in Montana, Eleanor replied. 5,000 acres, primarily cattle. I was the oldest of 4 children and the only one who showed any interest in the business. My father had no sons, so he taught me everything he knew, much to my mother's dismay. She disapproved. A wry smile touched Eleanor's lips. Mother was determined to raise a proper lady, despite evidence from an early age that I was neither small nor delicate. By 12, I was taller than she was. By 15, I could outwork most of the ranch hands. It was difficult for her to reconcile her expectations with reality. Nathaniel nodded, understanding all too well the burden of defying expectations. And your father? How did he feel about having a daughter who could outwork his men? Proud mostly, Eleanor said, a fond warmth entering her voice. He was a practical man. Said God gave me my size and strength for a reason, and it would be ungrateful to waste such gifts. He used to tell me, Elle, in this world, people will try to make you smaller to fit their ideas of what you should be. Don't let them. Take up all the space you were meant to occupy. Wise advice, Nathaniel murmured. Is he still living, your father? The warmth faded from Eleanor's expression. No, he died 6 years ago. The ranch was heavily mortgaged by then bad investments, a few years of drought. When he passed, the bank foreclosed. My mother and younger sisters went to live with an aunt in Boston. I stayed in Montana. There was more to that story, Nathaniel sensed, but he didn't press. Instead, he asked, and what did you do after losing the ranch? Eleanor's gaze shifted to the creek, where the floodwaters continued to recede, leaving debris caught in the branches of streamside bushes. I worked, ranch hand, cattle driver, horse trainer, whatever jobs would hire a woman my size. Some were more respectable than others. The careful way she phrased this made Nathaniel wonder what hardships she had endured, what compromises she might have been forced to make. But that was a path for another day when trust between them was more firmly established. And now you're here, he said instead, responding to an advertisement from a stranger agreeing to marry a man you'd never met. As are you, Eleanor pointed out. We've both taken quite a risk, haven't we? Nathaniel smiled at that. Indeed we have, though I suspect my risk was somewhat less than yours. A woman traveling alone to marry a stranger puts herself in a vulnerable position. Hence my omission regarding my size, Eleanor admitted. I've found that men who might take advantage of a small, delicate woman often reconsider when faced with someone of my stature. A practical precaution, Nathaniel acknowledged, though I hope you now understand it was unnecessary, at least with me. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. I believe I do. You're not what I expected, Nathaniel Reed, but I'm beginning to think that's for the best. Something warm unfurled in Nathaniel's chest at her words. Before he could respond, however, the distant sound of approaching horses caught their attention. They both stood instinctively, moving closer together as they peered through the trees boards toward the main trail. 3 riders appeared, making their way toward the ranch house. Even at a distance, Nathaniel recognized Victor Blackwood's imposing figure at the lead. The other 2 men were strangers to him, well-dressed with the polished appearance of city dwellers rather than local ranchers. Visitors, Nathaniel said, unable to keep a note of wariness from his voice, and not ones I was expecting. Eleanor had gone very still beside him, her posture suddenly tense. Do you know them? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Only Blackwood, the one in front. He owns the largest ranch in the valley about 5 miles north. The others I don't recognize. Eleanor nodded, her expression now composed but alert. We should return to the house. It would be impolite to keep your neighbors waiting. There was something in her tone, a forced casualness, perhaps, that made Nathaniel look at her more closely. Her face revealed nothing, but he noticed her hands had curled into fists at her sides, the knuckles white with tension. Eleanor, he said quietly, do you know those men? She met his gaze directly, and for a brief moment, he glimpsed something like fear in her eyes before it was masked by determination. I may, she admitted, but I can't be certain at this distance. Let's go and find out, shall we? Without waiting for his response, she began walking briskly toward the ranch house, her long strides forcing Nathaniel to hurry to keep pace. By the time they reached the yard, the three riders had already dismounted and were tying their horses to the hitching post. Blackwood turned as they approached, his expression shifting from impatience to poorly concealed amusement when he caught sight of them. "Doc," he greeted Nathaniel with a cursory nod before his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "And the new Mrs. Reed, I presume, though I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Not Mrs. Reed yet," Eleanor corrected him, her voice steady despite the tension Nathaniel could feel radiating from her. "Eleanor Grace, and you are Victor Blackwood, owner of the North Star Ranch." He gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen are James Wilson, representative of the Western Railroad Company, and Edward Sullivan, a surveyor. They're here to discuss the proposed railroad line through Willow Creek Valley." The two men tipped their hats politely, though Nathaniel noticed Sullivan's gaze lingering on Eleanor with an intensity that seemed more than casual interest. For her part, Eleanor acknowledged the introductions with a cool nod, betraying no sign of recognition. "We were surveying nearby properties and thought we'd stop by," Blackwood continued. "The railroad committee is considering several routes through the valley, and your land may be affected." Nathaniel frowned. "This is the first I'm hearing of any railroad plans. When was this decided?" "The project has been under discussion for some time," Wilson replied, his tone smoothly professional. "Several major landowners in the region have already expressed interest in selling rights of way." "Several landowners meaning Blackwood, I assume?" Nathaniel said dryly. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My property would be significantly impacted, yes, but the benefits to the entire valley would be substantial. Easier access to markets, increased property values, new opportunities for growth. And your sudden interest in my small ranch has nothing to do with your previous offers to buy me out?" Nathaniel asked. "Business is business, Doc," Blackwood replied with a shrug. "I've always said your land would be more valuable as part of a larger operation. The railroad situation just adds urgency to the proposition." Throughout this exchange, Nathaniel was acutely aware of Eleanor beside him, her posture rigid, her attention seemingly fixed on Sullivan, who continued to watch her with unsettling focus. "Well, gentlemen," Nathaniel said firmly, "I appreciate your stopping by, but we've just experienced significant flooding and have urgent repairs to attend to. Perhaps we could schedule a more convenient time to discuss these matters." Wilson began to nod agreeably, but Sullivan stepped forward, his gaze still locked on Eleanor. "Forgive me," he said, his refined Eastern accent at odds with the rough frontier setting. "But have we met before, Miss Grace? You seem remarkably familiar." Eleanor's face remained impressively impassive. "I don't believe so, Mr. Sullivan. I would remember meeting a railroad surveyor." "Perhaps in Montana, then," Sullivan persisted. "I conducted surveys there some years ago. The resemblance is quite striking, though the woman I'm thinking of used another name." A charged silence fell over the group. Nathaniel looked between Eleanor and Sullivan, sensing undercurrents he didn't understand, but instinctively distrusting the surveyor's seemingly casual inquiry. "I've spent time in many places, sir," Eleanor finally said, her tone cool, "as I imagine have you, but I don't recall our paths crossing." Sullivan smiled, a thin expression that didn't warm his calculating eyes. "My mistake, then, though I rarely forget a face, especially one so distinctive." The implied insult hung in the air. Nathaniel felt a surge of protective anger, but before he could respond, Blackwood clapped Sullivan on the shoulder. "Enough pleasantries," he said brusquely. "We've got 3 more properties to visit before sundown." He turned to Nathaniel. "Think about what I said, Doc. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Better to profit from it than stand in its way." With that thinly veiled threat, Blackwood mounted his horse. Wilson followed suit with a polite nod of farewell. Sullivan lingered a moment longer, his gaze still fixed on Eleanor. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Grace," he said, the emphasis on her surname subtle but unmistakable. "I'm sure we'll meet again soon." Only when the 3 riders had disappeared down the trail did Eleanor's rigid posture relax slightly. She let out a long, controlled breath, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the men had vanished from view. "You do know him," Nathaniel said quietly. It wasn't a question. Eleanor turned to face him, conflict evident in her expression. For a moment he thought she might deny it or deflect his observation. Instead, she nodded once decisively. "Yes, though not as Edward Sullivan's surveyor, and he most certainly knows me." She glanced toward the house. "This is a conversation best had indoors, I think." Nathaniel agreed, increasingly concerned by the subtle fear he'd glimpsed beneath Eleanor's composed exterior. Together they walked to the cabin, an unspoken tension stretching between them. Inside, Eleanor moved to the window, positioning herself to watch the trail while remaining mostly hidden from outside view. The defensive posture spoke volumes about her level of concern. His real name is Edwin Sutton, she said without preamble. He works for Senator Charles Montgomery of Montana, or at least he did when I knew him. He's not a surveyor. He's the senator's personal secretary and fixer. Nathaniel sat at the table processing this information. And who is Senator Montgomery to you? Eleanor's shoulders stiffened, but she kept her gaze on the window. My husband, or rather, my former husband. The revelation hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. You're married, he asked, unable to keep the shock from his voice. Widowed, Eleanor corrected, finally turning to face him. At least that's what Charles believes. It was necessary that he thinks so. Nathaniel stared at her, struggling to reconcile this new information with the woman he'd begun to know and admire. You faked your death. Yes. The single word carried the weight of a difficult choice, a desperate measure. It was the only way to escape. From what? Nathaniel asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to her left arm, rubbing at a spot just above the elbow. From a man who saw me as property rather than a person. From a marriage that had become a prison. Her voice remained level, but Nathaniel could hear the controlled emotion beneath the surface. From a powerful man who does not tolerate losing what he considers his. Nathaniel's medical instincts caught the significance of her unconscious gesture. He hurt you. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. Yes, though he was careful to ensure the marks wouldn't show when I accompanied him to social functions. A bitter smile twisted her lips. My size, which most found so objectionable, was perfect for Charles. It made him appear even more powerful to have such a large woman clearly under his control. How did you meet him? Nathaniel asked, trying to understand the full picture. Eleanor sighed, moving away from the window to sit across from him at the table. After my father died and we lost the ranch, I was desperate for work. Senator Montgomery was expanding his cattle operations and hired me as a manager for one of his properties. He'd heard of my father and knew of my reputation with livestock. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden tabletop. At first, he seemed to value my knowledge, my capabilities. He offered marriage after only 3 months, presenting it as a business arrangement that would benefit us both. But it changed after the wedding, Nathaniel guessed. Eleanor nodded. Almost immediately. What he truly wanted wasn't a capable ranch manager, but a curiosity to display the giant woman who nevertheless answered to his every command. When I objected to being paraded before his political associates like some trained bear, she trailed off, her expression darkening with memory. You don't need to tell me the details, Nathaniel said gently. No, I think I do, Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze directly. If Sullivan recognized me, and I'm certain he did, then you need to understand what kind of man Charles Montgomery is and what kind of danger that places us both in. She rose and moved to the stove, her back to Nathaniel, as she prepared coffee with methodical movements that suggested she was gathering her thoughts. The first time he struck me was after a dinner party where I'd spoken too knowledgeably about cattle breeding to one of his business associates. The man had been impressed, complimenting Charles on having such an intelligent wife. After the guest left, Charles broke 2 of my fingers and told me that men don't want intelligent wives, they want obedient ones. Nathaniel winced, his doctor's mind automatically cataloging the injury and its implications. Over the next year, it escalated. Eleanor continued, her voice detached, as though she were describing something that had happened to someone else. Burns from his cigars when I displeased him. Beatings that were carefully administered to leave no visible marks. Being locked in the root cellar for days when I needed to learn my place. She turned back to face him, coffee forgotten. The worst part was that everyone knew. His staff, his political colleagues, the local doctor who treated my injuries, they all knew, and no one said a word. His position protected him completely. How did you escape? Nathaniel asked, his throat tight with anger on her behalf. Opportunity and desperation, Eleanor replied. There was a fire at one of the outbuildings, not the main house, but a storage barn where Charles kept financial records and certain sensitive correspondence. In the chaos, with everyone focused on saving what they could from the flames, I took what money I could find and fled. She returned to the table, her movements controlled despite the difficult memories she was sharing. I let them believe I died in the fire. There was a young woman, one of the kitchen maids, who had also gone missing that night. They found human remains in the ashes, too badly burned for proper identification. It was assumed we had both been trapped inside. But Sullivan suspects otherwise, Nathaniel said grimly. Eleanor nodded. Sutton Sullivan was always more perceptive than Charles, and more dangerous in his own way. Charles's cruelty was hot-blooded, impulsive. Sutton's is cold, calculating. If he's here using a false name working with Blackwood on this railroad scheme, then Montgomery is involved somehow. Nathaniel finished for her. And your presence here is no coincidence. No, Eleanor agreed, her expression troubled. Though I don't believe they were looking for me specifically. I've been careful changing my name, my appearance as much as possible, moving frequently. The odds of them randomly encountering me here are too slim. Which means they're here for another reason, Nathaniel mused, and recognizing you was an unexpected development. Yes, this railroad plan, it must be significant to bring Charles's influence this far from Montana. He doesn't involve himself in minor ventures. Nathaniel considered this pieces beginning to fall into place. Blackwood has been trying to buy my land for years. I've always refused because this valley has been in my family for generations. Recently, his offers have become more insistent, almost aggressive. Your land must be critical to whatever they're planning, Eleanor said. Perhaps it's the only viable route for the railroad through this section of the valley. Possibly, though there's another potential factor. Nathaniel hesitated, then decided Eleanor deserved complete honesty after sharing her own painful history. There are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that gold was discovered in the hills just beyond my property line. The old-timers say my grandfather knew about it, but kept it secret, fearing what a gold rush would do to the valley. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. If that's true, and if Montgomery and Blackwood know or suspect, then the railroad could be a pretense or at least secondary to their real interest. Nathaniel finished. Access to potential gold deposits would be worth far more than any transportation route. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of their discoveries. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice quiet but firm. I should leave. Tonight, if possible. My presence here puts you in danger. Charles is not a man who forgives those who defy him, and if Sutton reports that I'm alive— No, Nathaniel interrupted with surprising vehemence. Running now would only confirm their suspicions. Besides, two people stand a better chance against whatever they're planning than either of us would alone. Eleanor looked skeptical. You don't know what Charles is capable of. He has political connections at the highest levels, financial resources beyond imagining, and absolutely no moral constraints when pursuing something he wants. And you don't know what I'm capable of, Nathaniel countered. I may be small in stature, but I survived 4 years as a field surgeon in the bloodiest war this country has ever seen. I've faced men like Montgomery before, men who believe their wealth or position places them above common decency. He reached across the table, not quite touching her, but offering his hand, palm up, in a gesture of alliance. We have time to plan. Sullivan or Sutton hasn't confirmed his suspicions yet. He's wary but not certain, and they'll move carefully if they believe there's gold involved. Rushing would attract unwanted attention. Eleanor studied his outstretched hand, conflict evident in her expression. You're proposing we stay and fight rather than flee, against a U.S. senator, a local power broker, and whatever hired muscle they can afford. I'm proposing we defend what's ours, Nathaniel corrected her, my land, your freedom, neither of which they have any right to take. A long moment passed as Eleanor considered his words. Then, with deliberate purpose, she placed her hand in his. Her palm was calloused, her fingers strong, dwarfing his smaller hand, yet the connection felt perfectly balanced, a joining of different but complementary strengths. Very well, she said, her gray eyes meeting his with newfound resolve. But we'll need to be smarter and better prepared than they expect. And you should know that by agreeing to stand with me, you are making yourself a target for a man who never forgets a slight and never leaves enemies alive. Nathaniel nodded, accepting this reality. I understand. And you should know that this valley has been defended by Reeds for 3 generations. I don't intend to be the first to lose it to men like Blackwood or Montgomery. Their hands remained joined across the table, a silent pact sealed in the quiet of the cabin as the afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows. Outside, Hudson bellowed from the barn, the sound strong and healthy, a reminder of what they'd already overcome together. We should check on him, Eleanor said reluctantly, withdrawing her hand, and then plan our next steps. Nathaniel agreed, rising from the table. As they moved toward the door, he noticed Eleanor glancing at the window again, her vigilance never entirely abandoned. Eleanor, he said softly, waiting until she turned to face him. Whatever happens, I want you to know that I don't regret your arrival. Despite the complications, despite the danger, I'm glad you're here. Something softened in her expression, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to surface. As am I, Nathaniel, though I fear you may have reason to change your mind before this is over. I doubt that very much, he replied with quiet confidence. Now let's see to Hudson. After all, we have a ranch to run regardless of what schemes are unfolding around us. As they walked to the barn together, Nathaniel was struck by the strange turns fate had taken. He had advertised for a gentle companion to ease his solitude, and instead found himself allied with a formidable woman against powerful enemies. It was not the future he had envisioned, but as he watched Eleanor stride purposefully beside him, he couldn't help feeling that perhaps it was the future he needed. The wooden ring still waited in his pocket, its purpose now uncertain. But Nathaniel left it where it was, a tangible reminder that life's most meaningful journeys rarely followed predictable paths. Over the next 2 weeks, life at Reed Ranch settled into a rhythm that belied the underlying tension of their situation. Each morning, Nathaniel and Eleanor rose at dawn to complete the necessary chores, feeding livestock, maintaining fences, tending the vegetable garden that Eleanor had expanded with medicinal herbs and more robust food crops. To an outside observer, they might have appeared to be simply a frontier couple working their land. But beneath this mundane surface, they were meticulously preparing for the confrontation they both knew was inevitable. Eleanor proved to be an invaluable partner in these preparations. Her knowledge of ranching far exceeded Nathaniel's, and under her guidance they implemented more efficient systems for water management and livestock rotation. Hudson, fully recovered from his poisoning, thrived under her care, becoming almost docile when she approached, a stark contrast to his usual temperamental nature. For his part, Nathaniel shared his medical knowledge, teaching Eleanor to identify and prepare various treatments for common injuries and ailments. They established a hidden cache of supplies in the root cellar medicines, preserved food, ammunition for Nathaniel's old army, revolver, resources they might need if forced to defend the ranch or flee quickly. They also gathered information carefully and discreetly. On supply trips to town, Nathaniel would engage in seemingly casual conversations with shopkeepers and townspeople, piecing together details about Blackwood's recent activities and the presence of strangers in the valley. What emerged was concerning. Blackwood had been buying up smaller ranches throughout the region, often using questionable tactics to pressure reluctant sellers. The railroad survey was real enough, but locals reported seeing armed men accompanying the surveyors, unusual for what should have been a purely technical assessment. Most troubling was news that Senator Charles Montgomery himself was expected to visit within the month, ostensibly to evaluate investment opportunities in the territory. His arrival would accelerate whatever plans were in motion and place Eleanor in immediate jeopardy. Through all of this, Nathaniel found himself increasingly drawn to Eleanor, not despite her differences from what he had expected in a bride, but because of them. Her strength, both physical and of character, her intelligence, her quiet determination in the face of danger, all combined to create a woman unlike any he had known before. They had not spoken further of marriage, tacitly agreeing that such discussions should wait until their more pressing concerns were resolved. Yet they had fallen into a domestic partnership that felt to Nathaniel at least more meaningful than any formal ceremony could have made it. They shared meals, conversations, the daily labor of the ranch. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Eleanor mending clothing or working leather, while Nathaniel read aloud from his medical journals or the occasional novel. It was a simple routine, but one that brought unexpected contentment to them both. On this particular evening, they were engaged in what had become a nightly ritual, Eleanor brushing and braiding her long dark hair, while Nathaniel organized his medical supplies, cataloging what needed replenishing on his next trip to town. The domesticity of the scene belied the vigilance they both maintained, with Nathaniel's revolver within easy reach and Eleanor's eyes frequently moving to the windows. "I was thinking," Nathaniel said, closing his medical bag, "that we should repair the roof on the west side of the barn tomorrow. The patch I made after the winter storms won't hold through another heavy rain." Eleanor nodded, her fingers deftly weaving her hair into a thick braid. "I noticed it was sagging. We'll need to replace at least 2 of the support beams as well. I have some suitable timber in the storage shed," Nathaniel replied, "though moving the larger pieces will be challenging." A small smile curved Eleanor's lips. "For you, perhaps. For me, less so." Nathaniel chuckled, acknowledging the truth of her statement. "One of the many benefits of your company, though I managed before you arrived, you know." "Barely from what I've seen," Eleanor teased, her tone lighter than usual. These moments of levity had become more frequent between them, brief respites from the underlying tension of their situation. Nathaniel was about to respond when a sharp knock at the door froze them both mid-conversation. They exchanged a quick glance, instantly alert. It was well after dark, an unusual time for visitors, especially given their remote location. Without a word, Nathaniel retrieved his revolver from the mantelpiece, while Eleanor moved silently to the side of the window, positioning herself to peek out without being easily visible from outside. "It's Martha Wilkins," she reported in a low voice, surprise evident in her tone. "Alone as far as I can tell." Nathaniel frowned. The widow who owned the general store was an unlikely visitor at any time, let alone after dark. She had made her disapproval of Eleanor quite clear during their trips to town, her pinched expression and barely civil greetings conveying what propriety prevented her from saying aloud. "Keep the revolver close," Eleanor advised as Nathaniel moved to answer the door. "This may be a distraction while others approach from another direction." Nathaniel nodded, concealing the weapon behind his back as he opened the door just wide enough to see their unexpected visitor. Martha Wilkins stood on the porch. Her normally immaculate appearance disheveled, her expression tense. She clutched a small valise in one hand and what appeared to be a folded document in the other. "Dr. Reed," she said without preamble, her voice tight with urgency. "I apologize for the late hour, but I must speak with you. It's a matter of some delicacy." Nathaniel hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, Mrs. Wilkins. You seem distressed." The older woman stepped inside, her gaze immediately finding Eleanor, who had moved away from the window, but remained standing, her posture wary. An awkward silence fell as the two women regarded each other. "Mrs. Wilkins," Eleanor acknowledged with a polite nod. To Nathaniel's surprise, Martha responded with an equally civil nod. "Miss Grace," she turned back to Nathaniel, "I'm afraid my business concerns you both. May we sit?" Curiosity now mingling with caution, Nathaniel gestured toward the table. As they seated themselves, Eleanor positioning herself to maintain a clear view of both the door and windows, Martha placed the document on the table between them. "This arrived by special courier this afternoon," she explained, unfolding what proved to be an official-looking letter. "It's a warrant for the arrest of one Eleanor Montgomery, wanted for arson, theft, and the murder of a servant girl in Montana 3 years ago." Eleanor's face remained impressively composed, though Nathaniel saw her hands clench briefly beneath the table. "That's quite serious," Nathaniel said carefully, "but I fail to see how it concerns us. My companion's name is Eleanor Grace." Martha's expression was knowing. "Come now, doctor. We both know that's not entirely accurate." She held up a hand as Nathaniel began to protest. "I'm not here as an accuser. I'm here to warn you." She slid the warrant across the table. "This was delivered to Sheriff Grant this afternoon, along with instructions to detain any woman matching the description until a representative of Senator Montgomery arrives to make a formal identification. The description, I should note, is remarkably similar to Miss Grace here." Eleanor reached for the document, her movements deliberate as she scanned its contents. "This is a forgery," she said finally, her voice steady. "A well-crafted one, but a forgery nonetheless. The territorial governor's signature is incorrect, and the court seal is slightly misaligned." Martha raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "You have experience with legal documents." "My father maintained extensive business records," Eleanor replied, setting the warrant down. "I learned to recognize proper form and authentication." She studied Martha with new intensity. "Why are you warning us? You've made it quite clear you disapprove of my presence here." A complicated expression crossed the older woman's face, discomfort mingled with resolve. "I disapprove of many things, Miss Grace. A woman wearing men's clothing, a mail-order bride who stands taller than most men, unconventional arrangements of all kinds." She straightened in her chair. "But I disapprove far more strongly of powerful men who abuse their positions to harm those weaker than themselves." She opened her valise and withdrew a faded daguerreotype, placing it beside the warrant. "My late husband, Robert, was a good man in most respects, but he had a temper, especially when drinking. After 20 years of marriage, I had more broken bones than I could count, and scars that will never fade." Nathaniel stared at the image, a younger Martha beside a barrel-chested man with a stern expression, understanding dawning. "You recognize the signs in Eleanor?" Martha nodded. "The watchfulness, the way she positions herself in a room, the careful assessment of every man who enters her vicinity." Her gaze shifted to Eleanor. "I don't know your story, Miss Grace, but I know enough of such men to recognize when someone has survived one." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her expression guarded. Then with deliberate care, she unbuttoned her left sleeve and rolled it up to reveal a pattern of small, circular scars, old burns that had healed poorly. "Senator Charles Montgomery," she said simply. "My husband for 2 years. A man who believes ownership extends to every aspect of his wife's being." Martha nodded, unsurprised. "The senator has been corresponding with Victor Blackwood for months. They're business partners in this railroad venture, though I suspect their true interest lies elsewhere." "The gold," Nathaniel said, pieces falling into place. "You know about it too." "Everyone of a certain age knows the rumors," Martha replied. "Robert's father was among those who helped your grandfather conceal evidence of the initial discovery. They feared what would happen to the valley if word got out." She reached into her valise again and produced a folded map. "Robert kept this hidden. I never knew why until recently, when I overheard Blackwood and that surveyor discussing the Reed gold as though its existence was confirmed." The map, yellowed with age, showed Willow Creek Valley in detailed topography. A section on Nathaniel's property was marked with a faded X, with notations in cramped handwriting along the margins. "This is my grandfather's writing," Nathaniel said with quiet awe, tracing the notations. "These are directions to the original find. Which explains Montgomery and Blackwood's interest, Eleanor added grimly. The railroad is merely a convenient cover for their true objective. Martha nodded. They plan to force you out one way or another. The warrant is just the beginning. Sheriff Grant has already deputized several men strangers to the valley, likely Montgomery's hired guns. She rose from the table, her expression resolute. You need to leave, both of you. Tonight if possible. I can delay them until morning by telling the sheriff I saw you heading toward Mason's Crossing, but after that, Nathaniel exchanged a glance with Eleanor, a silent communication passing between them. They had prepared for this possibility, had supplies and escape routes planned. But fleeing meant abandoning the ranch perhaps permanently. Why are you helping us? Eleanor asked the question that had clearly been troubling her since Martha's arrival. You owe us nothing. In fact, helping us places you in considerable danger. Martha's thin lips pressed together in a determined line. After Robert died, I promised myself I would never again stand silent while powerful men preyed on those with less power. I've broken that promise too many times out of fear or misguided propriety. She gathered her things, preparing to leave. Consider this my atonement. As she moved toward the door, Martha paused, turning back to Eleanor. For what it's worth, Miss Grace, I was wrong about you. Your unconventional qualities are precisely what Dr. Reed needs. He's been alone too long, and this valley needs someone strong enough to defend it. With that surprising endorsement, Martha Wilkins slipped out into the night, leaving Nathaniel and Eleanor to confront the decision before them. We need to go, Eleanor said, as soon as the door closed, already moving toward the bedroom where their emergency packs were stored. If they have a warrant, false or not, they have the appearance of legal authority. No one will question them. Nathaniel remained at the table, studying his grandfather's map with a furrowed brow. If we run, we lose everything. The ranch, the land that's been in my family for generations. He looked up at Eleanor, determination hardening his features. And they win Montgomery, Blackwood, all of them. Men who believe they can take whatever they want simply because they have the power to do so. Eleanor paused in the bedroom doorway, regarding him with a mixture of concern and understanding. Sometimes surviving is the only victory possible, Nathaniel. I learned that lesson painfully. And sometimes running only postpones the inevitable, he countered. They'll find us eventually. Men like Montgomery don't give up when they want something. He rose from the table, decision made. We won't flee like thieves in the night, but we won't stay to be slaughtered either. We'll hide the evidence they seek and relocate temporarily somewhere they won't think to look, but close enough to monitor their activities and plan our next move. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully, then nodded. The old line shack in the north pasture. It's far enough from the main house to be overlooked, but offers a clear view of the valley. We could observe who comes and goes without being detected. Exactly. Nathaniel folded the map carefully. We'll take only what we absolutely need. Make it appear we left in haste, but not so obvious that they immediately suspect a ruse. As they moved with practiced efficiency to gather supplies and create the illusion of a hasty departure, Nathaniel was struck by how seamlessly they worked together, anticipating each other's needs and actions without discussion. In just 2 weeks, they had developed the wordless coordination of partners who had shared years rather than days. Eleanor paused in her preparations, noticing his thoughtful expression. What is it? Nathaniel smiled, slightly oddly calm despite the danger closing in around them. I was just thinking that when I placed that advertisement for a bride, this is hardly what I imagined would result. A rare, full smile transformed Eleanor's face, the dimple in her right cheek deepening. I suspect we've both had to adjust our expectations considerably. For the better, I think, Nathaniel said softly. Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by an expression of careful hope. Do you truly believe that? Despite everything my presence has brought to your door, Nathaniel crossed to where she stood, looking up into her watchful gray eyes. I believe that some things are worth fighting for, Eleanor. This land, our freedom to choose our own paths. He hesitated, then added quietly, the possibility of what we might become together, given time and peace to discover it. For a moment, Eleanor seemed at a loss for words, emotion flickering across her normally composed features. Then with gentle deliberation, she bent down and pressed her lips to his forehead, a gesture both tender and respectful of the boundaries they had tacitly established. Then we should ensure we have that time, she said as she straightened, her voice slightly husky. Let's finish our preparations. Dawn isn't far off and we have much to do before then. Outside, the night was clear and cold stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Montana sky. Inside the small cabin, two people who had expected one kind of future found themselves embracing a very different one, uncertain, dangerous, but somehow more authentic than the life either had imagined when they first exchanged letters months before. The wooden ring remained in Nathaniel's pocket as they worked its purpose, evolving just as their relationship had, from a symbol of conventional marriage to something more complex and meaningful. A token of partnership forged in adversity, strengthened by shared purpose, and illuminated by the first tentative glow of something that might, given time, become love. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Valley in a wash of pale gold, illuminating dew-laden grass and the lingering wisps of morning mist that clung to the creek banks. From the vantage point of the old line shack perched on a rise in the northern pasture, Nathaniel and Eleanor had an unobstructed view of the main house and barn below. They had worked through the night, first creating the illusion of a hasty departure, overturned furniture, scattered belongings, the door left ajar, then transporting essential supplies to their temporary refuge. The line shack was little more than a one-room shelter built for ranch hands during the harsh winter months, with a small stove, a narrow cot, and rough plank walls that allowed the morning breeze to whistle through countless cracks and gaps. Despite its rudimentary nature, the shack offered two crucial advantages. It was positioned to see without being seen, and it was the last place anyone would look for a physician accustomed to modest comforts. "Riders coming," Eleanor said quietly, lowering the spyglass she had been using to survey the valley. 6 of them, Blackwood in the lead with Sheriff Grant beside him. Nathaniel moved to join her at the small window, their shoulders touching in the confined space. The others. Sullivan or Sutton is there, the rest appear to be hired guns, heavily armed. She passed him the spyglass, and Nathaniel confirmed her assessment. The approaching riders moved with purpose, their postures suggesting men accustomed to violence. He recognized Sheriff Grant's portly figure and Blackwood's imposing silhouette, but the others were strangers, hard-faced men who sat their horses with the easy confidence of those who lived by gun and blade. "They're not bothering with subtlety," Nathaniel observed grimly. "This isn't a legal arrest, it's an armed seizure." Eleanor's expression remained composed, but he noticed her hands clench briefly at her sides. Charles never was one for subtlety when force would suffice. He believes overwhelming power renders resistance futile. They watched in silence as the riders reached the main house. 2 men dismounted and entered with guns drawn, while the others spread out to check the barn and outbuildings. After several minutes, the searchers reconvened in the yard, their body language conveying frustration. "They've discovered we're gone," Nathaniel said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Now they'll have to decide whether to track us or wait for us to return." "Blackwood seems to be arguing with the sheriff," Eleanor noted, reclaiming the spyglass. "Grant doesn't look pleased with the situation." "He's a decent man at heart," Nathaniel explained, "ineffectual and easily influenced, but not corrupt. This display of force probably exceeds what he was led to expect." Their observation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the shack's door. Both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. They had been so focused on the scene below that they'd failed to notice anyone approaching. Nathaniel reached for his revolver, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. She shook her head, nodding toward the window where the riders remained clearly visible in the yard below. Whoever was at their door wasn't part of that group. "To read," called a familiar voice. "Miss Grace, it's Martha Wilkins. I'm alone." With cautious relief, Nathaniel opened the door to find the shopkeeper standing on the threshold, a basket covered with a cloth in her arms. She looked exhausted, with dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. "Mrs. Wilkins," Nathaniel greeted her, stepping aside to allow her entry. "How did you find us?" "This was my husband's hunting cabin years ago," she explained, placing the basket on the small table. "When you didn't take the road east, as I'd suggested, I guessed you might have sought higher ground with a view of your property." Eleanor secured the door behind her, her posture still wary. "You've taken a considerable risk coming here. They could have followed you." "I've lived in this valley for 40 years, Miss Grace. I know how to move without being seen." Martha uncovered the basket, revealing bread, cheese, and a jar of preserved peaches. "I thought you might need provisions and information." Nathaniel gestured for her to sit on the room's only chair while he and Eleanor perched on the edge of the cot. "What's happening in town? What are they saying about us?" Martha's thin lips compressed into a grim line. "The official story is that you're both wanted for questioning regarding a murder in Montana. Unofficially, Blackwood has offered a substantial reward for information leading to your capture." "And the townspeople?" Eleanor asked. "Where do they stand?" "Divided," Martha replied. "Some believe the charges, particularly those who already found your arrangement, unconventional. Others are suspicious of Blackwood's sudden interest in law enforcement." She fixed them with a penetrating gaze. "The murder charge is a fabrication, I assume?" "Completely," Eleanor confirmed. "The servant girl mentioned in the warrant disappeared the night of the fire, but she didn't die. I helped her escape to Canada." Martha nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I suspected as much." The urgency of their pursuit suggested something beyond mere justice. She hesitated, then added, "There's more. Senator Montgomery himself is expected to arrive on tomorrow's stage. He's traveling with additional men, professional trackers, according to the telegram Blackwood received. Nathaniel absorbed this information, his mind already calculating what it meant for their precarious situation. They're committing significant resources to this. It confirms our suspicion that the gold is their primary objective. Not entirely, Eleanor said quietly. Charles would commit these resources to reclaim me alone. His pride would demand it. Her gaze shifted to the window where the searchers could be seen spreading out from the main house, beginning a methodical sweep of the surrounding land. He cannot abide losing what he considers his property. Martha watched her with a knowing expression. Men like that never change, Miss Grace. My Robert was the same, convinced that marriage granted him ownership rather than partnership. An understanding passed between the two women, transcending their differences in age and temperament. Nathaniel observed it with a mixture of sadness and respect, aware that he could never fully comprehend the bond forged by shared suffering. We need to make a decision, he said after a moment. We can't remain here indefinitely. Once Montgomery arrives with trackers, this hiding place won't stay secret for long. We could still flee, Eleanor suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. Head west into the mountains, then north toward Canada. Nathaniel shook his head. Winter comes early in the high country. We'd be trapped by snow before reaching the border. He turned to Martha. How many men does Blackwood have altogether? Including those who arrived with Sullivan, perhaps 10, with more coming with the senator tomorrow. Martha's expression grew troubled. Dr. Reed, you can't possibly be considering confronting them directly. The odds are impossible. Not directly, no, Nathaniel replied, a plan beginning to form in his mind. But we might be able to use their own objectives against them. Eleanor studied him intently. You're thinking of the gold. Yes, Blackwood and Montgomery want it badly enough to commit men and resources to fabricate charges and risk exposing their corrupt alliance. Nathaniel rose and began pacing the small space energy, infusing his slight frame. What if we offer to lead them to it, under certain conditions, of course? Conditions they would never honor once they had what they wanted, Eleanor pointed out. Charles would agree to anything, then betray you the moment the gold was secured. I'm counting on that, Nathaniel said, a grim smile touching his lips. Their predictable treachery is what makes the plan viable. Martha looked between them, confusion evident on her lined face. I don't understand. How does expecting betrayal help your situation? Because we'll be prepared for it, Nathaniel explained, and because we won't actually be leading them to the gold, at least not the main deposit. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. A false location. Somewhere we could control the situation, perhaps even set a trap. Exactly. The valley has numerous caves and abandoned mining attempts from the early days. We choose one salted with enough gold to be convincing, then ensure the site works to our advantage rather than theirs. Martha frowned, considering the strategy. It might delay them, but once they discover the deception, they'll be even more determined to find the real deposit. By then, we'll have gathered evidence of their illegal activities, Nathaniel countered. The false warrant, the armed intimidation, the conspiracy to seize property through fraudulent means. Enough to send to the territorial governor and federal marshals. That assumes you can collect such evidence and dispatch it before they realize your intentions, Martha said skeptically, and that the authorities would act against a U.S. senator and prominent local businessman on the word of a physician and a woman with a complicated past. Eleanor had risen to join Nathaniel by the window, her expression thoughtful as she gazed down at the searchers combing the property below. She's right. We'd need something more compelling than our testimony, documented proof of their crimes, preferably in their own words or writing. Nathaniel nodded, acknowledging the challenge. Which means we need to separate Montgomery and Blackwood from their men, get them to incriminate themselves, and record it somehow. A near impossible task, Martha commented. Unless, she trailed off, her eyes widening slightly as a new thought struck her. Unless you had help from someone they wouldn't suspect. Eleanor turned to her sharply. You're not suggesting yourself, Mrs. Wilkins. The risk would be considerable, Martha interrupted, but perhaps worth taking. They see me as a harmless widow, practically invisible. A hint of bitter amusement colored her tone. Men like Blackwood and Montgomery never truly see women like me, too old, too plain, to register as anything but background furniture. Nathaniel studied her with new respect. What exactly are you proposing? Access, information, a presence they won't guard against. Martha straightened in her chair, a determination in her bearing that belied her years. Blackwood takes his meals at my establishment when in town. The senator will likely do the same upon his arrival. I can ensure their private conversations aren't quite as private as they believe. Eleanor and Nathaniel exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. The plan was dangerous, dependent on variables they couldn't fully control, yet it offered a path forward beyond simple flight or hopeless confrontation. "We would need to coordinate carefully," Eleanor said finally, "establish signals contingencies for when things inevitably go wrong, and ensure Mrs. Wilkins has a plausible reason for any unusual behavior," Nathaniel added. "Her safety must be a priority." Martha made a dismissive gesture. "I've lived a full life, Dr. Reed, and spent too much of it in silence when I should have spoken. This is my chance to correct that failing." The three of them bent their heads together, refining the plan as morning stretched toward noon. Outside, the searchers continued their methodical sweep of the property, unaware that the subjects of their hunt were observing them from above, preparing a counter-strategy that would transform pursued into pursuers. As they talked, Nathaniel found himself drawing strength from Eleanor's calm intelligence and Martha's unexpected resolve. He had spent years believing his small stature made him inherently weaker than men like Blackwood, less capable, less effective in this harsh frontier world. Yet here he was, planning to outwit rather than overpower his adversaries, using brain rather than brawn to defend what was his. And he wasn't doing it alone. The women beside him brought perspectives and capabilities he lacked, creating a whole greater than the sum of its parts. It was a revelation that shifted something fundamental in his understanding of strength. By early afternoon, they had established the framework of their plan. Martha would return to town, positioning herself to gather intelligence on Montgomery's arrival and the search's progress. Eleanor and Nathaniel would relocate to a more secure hiding place, deeper in the hills, where they would prepare the false gold site and draft the messages that would eventually be sent to territorial authorities. As Martha prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her expression suddenly uncertain. "There's one more thing you should know. Something I've never told anyone." She hesitated, then continued. "Robert didn't die of heart failure as everyone believes. He died because I finally fought back after 20 years of beatings. He was drunk, threatening me with a fire poker. I pushed him away harder than I intended. He fell, struck his head on the hearth." The confession hung in the air, stark and unexpected. Eleanor was the first to respond, moving to place a gentle hand on the older woman's shoulder. "You defended yourself," she said simply, "as was your right." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've carried the secret so long, wondering if I was truly different from the monsters who hurt others deliberately." She looked between them. "I tell you this not to unburden myself, but so you understand why I must help you. Some debts can never be repaid, but perhaps they can be honored through actions that prevent others from suffering similarly." Nathaniel approached, his expression solemn. "Your secret is safe with us, Mrs. Wilkins, and your help is accepted with gratitude." After Martha's departure, carefully timed to avoid the searchers, Nathaniel and Eleanor prepared to relocate. They packed their meager supplies in silence, each absorbed in private thoughts, until Eleanor spoke. "Her story," she said quietly, securing a canteen to her pack. "It reminds me that violence leaves wounds in both victim and perpetrator. The visible marks fade, but the inner damage endures." Nathaniel paused in his own preparations, struck by the depth of understanding in her words. "Is that why you chose to flee rather than fight when you left Montgomery? Not fear for yourself, but fear of what fighting back might make you become?" Eleanor's hand stilled, her gaze distant. "Partly. There were moments, many moments, when I could have ended it permanently. I was stronger than Charles physically, despite his belief otherwise. But I feared crossing that line would transform me into something unrecognizable." She met Nathaniel's eyes directly. "I still do." The confession carried a weight beyond its simple words, a glimpse into Eleanor's deepest concerns about the confrontation that lay ahead. Nathaniel moved to stand before her, looking up into her troubled gray eyes. "We are not defined by the violence done to us," he said gently, "nor by the violence we may be forced to commit in self-defense. What defines us is the purpose behind our actions, the values we uphold even in the darkest moments." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. "You speak from experience." "The war," Nathaniel confirmed. "I took an oath to heal, yet found myself in circumstances where taking life became necessary to save others. That contradiction haunted me for years." He offered a small, sad smile. "It still does on the darkest nights." Without hesitation, Eleanor reached out to touch his face, her large hand cradling his cheek with surprising tenderness. "Then we share more than I realized. Both healers by nature, both marked by experiences that challenge that fundamental aspect of ourselves." The moment stretched between them, intimate and revelatory. Nathaniel found himself leaning slightly into her touch, drawing comfort from the connection. Then a distant shout from the searchers below broke the spell, reminding them of the pressing danger. "We should go," Eleanor said, withdrawing her hand reluctantly. "While they're concentrated on the lower pastures." Nathaniel nodded, the practical concerns of their situation reasserting themselves. Yet as they slipped out of the line shack and began their careful journey toward the hills, he felt a subtle shift in their relationship, a deepening understanding, the growing trust that transcended their initial arrangement and the circumstances that had brought them together. The wooden ring remained in his pocket, its significance evolving with each passing day. No longer merely a symbol of a conventional marriage, it had become something more meaningful, a token of a partnership being forged through shared adversity and mutual respect. And perhaps Nathaniel reflected as they made their way through the concealing underbrush, something even more precious was taking root between them. Something neither had expected to find when they first exchanged letters months ago. The cave they selected as their new hiding place was a natural formation in the hillside above the valley, its entrance concealed by a thick growth of scrub pine and wild roses. Inside it extended perhaps 30 feet into the rock face, dry and surprisingly warm after the cool spring air outside. Previous occupants, likely trappers or prospectors, had left behind a crude stone fire ring and a stack of split wood against one wall. Defensible, Eleanor commented as they settled their supplies. Single entrance, good visibility of the approach, solid rock at our backs. If they do find us, we'd have the advantage. Nathaniel nodded, appreciating her tactical assessment. During their journey to the cave, Eleanor had pointed out natural features and animal signs with the practiced eye of someone deeply attuned to the wilderness. It was yet another facet of this remarkable woman that continued to surprise and impress him. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he replied, arranging their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire ring. "The goal is to confront them on our terms, not theirs." "Speaking of which," Eleanor said, kneeling to organize their provisions, "we still need to identify the false gold site, somewhere convincing but controllable." Nathaniel withdrew his grandfather's map from an inner pocket, spreading it carefully on a flat rock. "There's an abandoned test shaft about half a mile from here. Grandfather's notes indicate it showed traces of gold, but not in quantities worth pursuing at the time." Eleanor moved to study the map beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she leaned in. "Perfect. Genuine enough to be believable, remote enough to limit their manpower advantage." "And the real deposit?" Nathaniel asked, tracing the faded X that had caused so much trouble. "It's here in the North Ridge. My grandfather wrote that he sealed the entrance after taking samples, disguising it to appear as a natural rockfall." Eleanor examined the location, her expression thoughtful. "If we succeed, what will you do with it? A gold mine would transform this valley, bring prospectors and developers, change everything you've built here." It was a question Nathaniel had contemplated often since discovering the map's significance. "I'm not sure the deposit is as extensive as Montgomery and Blackwood believe. Grandfather's notes suggest it's valuable, but limited enough to secure the ranch's future, perhaps establish a proper clinic in town, but not enough to justify major mining operations. And if it is larger?" Nathaniel considered this, aware that his answer revealed much about his character and values. "Then I would extract only what was needed, resealing the rest. Some treasures are best left buried, their true value lying in their potential rather than their exploitation." Eleanor's lips curved in a small smile. "A philosophy Montgomery and Blackwood would find incomprehensible." "Which is precisely why they must never control it," Nathaniel replied firmly. "Men who view the world solely as resources to be consumed eventually consume themselves." They spent the remainder of the day preparing the false site, carefully placing small gold nuggets from Nathaniel's grandfather's samples in strategic locations within the abandoned shaft. The work was meticulous, designed to create an impression of a significant find while controlling where searchers would focus their attention. As dusk approached, they returned to the cave, tired but satisfied with their preparations. Eleanor built a small, smokeless fire while Nathaniel prepared a simple meal from their provisions. They ate in companionable silence, conserving energy for the challenges ahead. After clearing away their meal, Eleanor surprised Nathaniel by producing a small, leather-bound book from her pack, a volume of Whitman's poetry he recognized from his own bookshelf. "I hope you don't mind," she said, a hint of self-consciousness in her tone. "I took it when we left the house. Reading has always been my refuge in difficult times." "Of course I don't mind," Nathaniel assured her, touched by this glimpse of vulnerability. "Whitman is a particular favorite of mine." Eleanor opened the book carefully, her large hands surprisingly delicate as she turned the well-worn pages. "Song of the Open Road," she read. It seemed appropriate to our current circumstances. She began to read aloud, her deep voice giving new resonance to the familiar words. "Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy free the world before me, the long brown path before me, leading wherever I choose." The poetry filled their small sanctuary, transforming the cave from a mere hiding place into something approaching a home. Nathaniel watched Eleanor as she read her strong profile illuminated by firelight, her expression softening with each verse. Here was yet another layer to this complex woman, an appreciation for beauty and language that belied her practical exterior. When she finished reading, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Nathaniel found himself reluctant to disturb the moment, yet aware that tomorrow would bring Senator Montgomery's arrival, and with it the implementation of their precarious plan. "We should rest," Eleanor said, finally closing the book with care. "Tomorrow will demand all our strength and focus." Nathaniel nodded, banking the fire to provide warmth without betraying their location with excessive light or smoke. As they prepared to sleep, he was acutely conscious of Eleanor's presence across the small space so near, yet separated by unspoken boundaries neither had yet dared to cross. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said softly as they settled onto their bedrolls, "there's something I should tell you about the fire that allowed my escape from Charles." He turned toward her voice in the dimness, sensing the importance of what she was about to share. "I'm listening." Eleanor was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I didn't just flee during the chaos, I caused it." The confession emerged quietly but clearly. "I set the fire deliberately, choosing a storage building where no one would be harmed, but which contained documents Charles valued, financial records, correspondence with political allies, evidence of bribes and corrupt dealings." Nathaniel absorbed this revelation, understanding its significance. "You destroyed the evidence of his crimes and created the opportunity for my disappearance," Eleanor confirmed. "The kitchen maid I mentioned, Lily, had suffered Charles's unwanted advances. She was willing to flee to let them believe she perished in the flames. We left together, traveling as far as Denver before separating." "You saved her," Nathaniel observed. "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. "But I've often wondered if my actions that night make me no better than Charles himself. I destroyed property, deceived people, allowed a community to believe a young woman had died tragically." The vulnerability in her admission touched Nathaniel deeply. Here was Eleanor, strong, capable, as seemingly invulnerable, revealing the moral doubt that had haunted her since her escape. "There's a fundamental difference," he said after considering her words. "Everything you did was to free yourself and Lily from genuine harm, with care taken to ensure no one else would be injured. Your goal was liberation, not control or exploitation." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The morality of an act, it isn't determined solely by the act itself, but by its intent and context." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Nathaniel wondered if she had fallen asleep. Then her voice came again, barely above a whisper. "Thank you for seeing the distinction I've struggled to articulate even to myself. It's easier sometimes to see clearly in others what we question in ourselves," Nathaniel replied gently. Another silence fell between them, but it was different now, lighter, as though a weight had been partially lifted. Just as Nathaniel was drifting towards sleep, Eleanor spoke once more. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that responding to your advertisement was the first truly free choice I made after escaping Charles. And despite all that has followed, I've never regretted it." The simple statement carried more meaning than any formal declaration could have conveyed. Nathaniel felt something shift and settle within his chest, a certainty that had been building since Eleanor's arrival now crystallized by her words. "Nor have I," he replied softly. "Regretted it, that is, not for a moment." Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, the sky a perfect unmarked blue above the valley. From their vantage point near the cave entrance, Nathaniel and Eleanor watched as the stagecoach rolled into town precisely at noon, right on schedule. Through the spyglass, they observed a distinguished-looking man descend from the coach, tall and imposing despite his 60 years, with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. Even at a distance, Senator Charles Montgomery projected an aura of authority that made those around him seem diminished by comparison. "That's him," Eleanor confirmed, her voice carefully neutral, despite the tension evident in her posture. "And the men behind him, the ones with the canvas packs, those are the trackers." Nathaniel studied the new arrivals through the spyglass, noting their rough appearance and weathered faces. "They look experienced." "They are. Charles used them to hunt down runaway servants and debtors who tried to flee his influence." Eleanor's expression hardened. "They rarely failed." Nathaniel lowered the spyglass, turning to meet her gaze directly. "Are you certain you want to proceed with the plan? We could still head west, lose ourselves in the mountains until winter forces them to abandon the search." Eleanor shook her head, resolution replacing the momentary apprehension in her eyes. "No, running would mean always looking over our shoulders, always wondering when they might catch up. Better to confront this now on ground we've chosen." Her use of "we" and "our" wasn't lost on Nathaniel, a linguistic acknowledgement that their fates had become intertwined, their challenges shared. He nodded, respecting her decision. "Then we continue as planned. Martha should make contact by sundown, bringing news of Montgomery's intentions and any adjustments we need to make. They spent the day in careful preparation, checking and rechecking the false gold site, ensuring their evidence was secure, refining the message that would eventually be sent to territorial authorities. Throughout these practical tasks, Nathaniel was acutely aware of Eleanor's heightened vigilance, her senses clearly attuned to any sign of approaching danger. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, a flicker of movement in the brush below their position caught Eleanor's attention. She signaled silently to Nathaniel, both of them dropping into defensive postures as they awaited identification of the approaching figure. Relief washed over them as Martha Wilkins emerged from the concealing vegetation, making her way steadily up the slope. Despite her age, she moved with surprising agility, leaving minimal signs of her passage, a skill developed through decades of navigating these hills. "They're preparing to move at dawn," she reported without preamble once safely inside the cave. "Montgomery has convinced Sheriff Grant that you're both dangerous fugitives who must be apprehended immediately. He's deputized the trackers, giving their pursuit an appearance of legal authority." "As expected," Nathaniel acknowledged. "What of Blackwood and Sullivan?" "They'll accompany the search party ostensibly to assist, but actually to ensure Montgomery's interests are protected." Martha withdrew a folded paper from her sleeve. "I managed to copy this from Sullivan's documents while serving their dinner. It appears to be a contract of some kind, though much of the legal language is beyond my understanding." Nathaniel unfolded the paper, carefully scanning its contents with Eleanor reading over his shoulder. "It's an agreement for mineral rights," he explained, "between Montgomery Blackwood and the Western Railroad Company. It grants them exclusive mining privileges on—" He paused, his expression darkening. "On my property and adjacent lands, contingent upon successful acquisition of said properties." "They've already divided the spoils," Eleanor observed grimly, "for they've even secured the land or confirmed the gold's existence." "There's more," Martha added. "They've been questioning townspeople about both of you, particularly Miss Grace's background. Sullivan seems convinced she's Montgomery's missing wife, though the senator himself remains publicly noncommittal." Eleanor tensed beside him. "He's being cautious. Charles never makes accusations he can't substantiate, especially when his pride is at stake. He'll want absolute confirmation before acknowledging that his supposedly dead wife is actually alive." "Which means we have a narrow window of opportunity," Nathaniel concluded. "Once he's certain, his approach will shift from pursuit to direct confrontation." Martha nodded grimly. "I overheard Sullivan suggesting they split their forces, some to continue searching the valley, others to establish roadblocks on all routes leading out. They're determined to prevent your escape." "Then we must accelerate our timeline," Eleanor said decisively. "Instead of waiting for them to find the false site, we'll lead them to it." Nathaniel turned to her sharply. "That means revealing ourselves. The risk is considerable," Eleanor acknowledged, "but less than being cornered with no control over the circumstances of our confrontation." She addressed Martha. "Can you convey a message to Blackwood? Something that would draw him, Montgomery and Sullivan, to the false site with minimal additional forces?" Martha considered this. "A note suggesting a meeting to negotiate terms might work. Blackwood's greed would ensure his attendance, and Montgomery's personal interest in you would guarantee his." "And the trackers," Nathaniel asked, "they're the greatest physical threat." "We separate them from their employers," Eleanor replied. "Create a diversion that draws them in another direction while the principals come to the meeting site." The plan took shape quickly, each contributing refinements based on their unique knowledge and perspectives. Martha would deliver a message proposing a meeting at the abandoned mine shaft at dusk the following day, ostensibly to negotiate surrender terms. Meanwhile, Eleanor would create tracks leading in the opposite direction, drawing the trackers away from the confrontation. "This increases the danger to you both," Martha noted with concern. "If something goes wrong, if they bring more men than expected, then we implement our contingency," Nathaniel assured her, patting the pocket containing his grandfather's map. "But I believe their desire for secrecy works in our favor. Too many witnesses would complicate their plans for the gold." As Martha prepared to depart with their carefully worded message, she hesitated, studying them with an expression of maternal concern. "Be careful," she said simply. "Both of you. Our risks are necessary, but neither of you deserves to suffer further at the hands of such men." After her departure, Nathaniel and Eleanor sat in thoughtful silence, the gravity of their decision settling around them. Tomorrow would bring either resolution or disaster, perhaps both. "I want you to have this," Nathaniel said, finally reaching into his pocket to withdraw the wooden ring he had carried since before Eleanor's arrival. "Not as a formal proposal, but as insurance, I suppose. A token to remember that whatever happens tomorrow, these past weeks have meant something significant." Eleanor accepted the small box with a questioning look. When she opened it to reveal the polished wooden ring, her expression softened with surprise and something deeper, more complex. It's beautiful, she said quietly, lifting it to examine the craftsmanship. You made this yourself. Nathaniel nodded. Before you arrived, when I imagined a different future than the one we now face. Eleanor's keen eyes noted the barely visible seam along the ring's inner surface. With careful fingers, she discovered the sliding panel that concealed the hidden compartment. When she opened it to reveal the small slip of paper bearing Sarah's name, her gaze lifted to meet Nathaniel's understanding rather than hurt in her expression. Your wife, she said simply. You carry her memory with you. Yes, Nathaniel acknowledged. Not as a barrier to new beginnings, but as an acknowledgement that our past shapes us, remains part of us, even as we move forward. He hesitated, then added, There's room for another name beside hers, should you ever wish it to be there. The implication hung between them, neither a demand nor a formal proposal, but an opening of possibility extended without pressure or expectation. Eleanor closed the hidden compartment with gentle fingers, then to Nathaniel's surprise slipped the ring onto the third finger of her right hand. For now, I'll wear it here, she said, her voice slightly husky with emotion, as a symbol of partnership rather than possession. If we survive tomorrow's confrontation, perhaps we can discuss its permanent placement. The gesture moved Nathaniel deeply, her acceptance of the ring on her own terms, acknowledging its current significance, while leaving space for what might develop between them in the future. He realized, the perfect response from a woman who valued autonomy as fiercely as she did connection. A wise compromise, he agreed, his own voice not entirely steady, and a powerful motivation to ensure we both emerge from tomorrow's encounter unscathed. Eleanor's smile held a mix of determination and tender amusement. Indeed, I find I'm quite looking forward to that discussion. They spent the remainder of the evening making final preparations, checking weapons, rehearsing signals, and establishing contingencies for various scenarios. The work was practical, focused, yet underpinned by a new awareness of what they stood to lose should their plan fail, not just their lives or freedom, but the promise of something neither had expected to find in this remote valley. As they settled beside the banked fire for what might be their last night of safety, Eleanor reached across the space between their bedrolls to take Nathaniel's hand. The touch was simple, direct, a physical affirmation of the bond that had formed between them, transcending their initial arrangement to become something neither could have anticipated. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said softly, know that you have given me something I thought lost forever. The belief that partnership need not mean subjugation. That strength comes in many forms, and that being seen for who I truly am is the greatest gift of all. Nathaniel curled his fingers around hers, the contrast in their sizes, somehow perfect, complementary, rather than mismatched. And you've shown me that courage isn't measured by physical stature, but by the willingness to face fear rather than flee from it. That true strength often lies in vulnerability, in opening oneself to possibility, despite past wounds. They fell asleep with hands still joined, a tenuous connection across the physical space that separated them, a space that seemed to diminish with each passing day, each shared challenge, each moment of deeper understanding. Outside, the night wrapped around their hidden sanctuary stars, wheeling overhead in ancient patterns that had witnessed countless human dramas unfold in the valley below. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and perhaps resolution, but tonight offered a precious interlude of connection and quiet certainty amid the gathering storm. Dawn came too quickly, the first pale light filtering through the cave entrance to find Nathaniel and Eleanor already awake, making final preparations in focused silence. They had reviewed the plan countless times, each step, each contingency, each potential complication, anticipated and addressed as thoroughly as possible. Martha had returned briefly before midnight, confirming that their message had been delivered and apparently accepted. Blackwood, Montgomery, and Sullivan had agreed to the meeting, their greed and arrogance leading them to believe they held the upper hand in any negotiation. Remember, Nathaniel said as they prepared to leave the cave, the goal is to extract incriminating statements about their plans for the gold and the illegal methods they've employed. Once we have that evidence recorded, we signal Martha to bring Sheriff Grant to the site. Eleanor nodded, securing her hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat that partially shadowed her face. And if they bring more men than expected, or if the trackers aren't successfully diverted, then we implement the secondary plan, Nathaniel replied grimly, leading them to the real gold deposit but triggering the rockfall I've prepared at the entrance. It would trap them long enough for us to reach town and telegraph the territorial governor directly. They double-checked their supplies one final time, the small journal Nathaniel would use to record incriminating statements, the signal mirror to alert Martha weapons as a last resort. Then, with a shared look of determination, they set out to execute their dangerous plan. Eleanor departed first, heading north to lay the false trail that would draw the trackers away from the abandoned mineshaft. Her skill in woodcraft developed through years of ranch work and her subsequent life on the move made her the logical choice for this critical diversion. Nathaniel watched her go with a mixture of admiration and concern, the wooden ring on her right hand catching the morning light as she waved a brief farewell. Then he turned his attention to his own tasks, making his way to the false gold site to ensure all was prepared for the coming confrontation. The abandoned mine shaft was a narrow horizontal tunnel cut into the hillside, its entrance partially obscured by years of vegetation growth. Inside, rough-hewn supports held back the weight of the mountain, creating a space perhaps 50 feet deep that ended in a rockfall. Nathaniel had carefully placed his grandfather's gold samples throughout the tunnel, creating the impression of a rich vein that extended deeper into the mountain. Near the entrance, he established his position in a natural alcove that offered both concealment and a clear view of anyone entering the shaft. There he waited as the sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying as noon passed and afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley floor. Eleanor returned shortly before the appointed meeting time, slipping into the alcove beside him with the silent grace that belied her size. "The trackers took the bait," she reported in a whisper. "They're following my trail north, convinced they've found fresh signs of our passage." Nathaniel nodded, relieved that this crucial element of their plan had succeeded. "Any sign of Montgomery and the others?" Approaching from the east as expected, 3 riders, Montgomery, Blackwood, and Sullivan. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Charles is carrying a rifle in addition to his sidearm. They're expecting trouble despite the pretext of negotiations." "Good," Nathaniel replied grimly. "Let them be cautious. It makes our task of extracting incriminating statements more challenging but more rewarding if we succeed." They settled into position, Eleanor's solid presence beside him, a reassurance as they awaited the arrival of their adversaries. Despite the very real danger, Nathaniel felt surprisingly calm, focused, alert, but not consumed by fear. Having Eleanor at his side, their strengths complementing each other's weaknesses, gave him a confidence he might otherwise have lacked. The sound of approaching horses broke the afternoon silence. Through a gap in the foliage, they watched as 3 riders dismounted at the base of the slope, securing their horses before beginning the climb toward the mine entrance. Senator Charles Montgomery led the way, his imposing figure even more commanding in person than it had been at a distance. He moved with the deliberate confidence of a man accustomed to control his silver-streaked hair and tailored clothing, marking him as someone of wealth and influence, even in this remote setting. Behind him came Victor Blackwood, his broad frame dwarfing Sullivan, who brought up the rear with a nervous vigilance that suggested he trusted neither his companions nor the situation they were entering. "They're armed," Eleanor whispered, noting the visible weapons each man carried, "and Sullivan appears to be watching their backs rather than the trail ahead. He suspects a trap." "As well he should," Nathaniel murmured, "but his caution works in our favor. They'll be listening carefully, seeking any advantage, including incriminating statements from each other." The 3 men paused at the mine entrance, surveying the area with suspicious eyes, before Montgomery gestured for them to proceed inside. As they moved past the alcove where Nathaniel and Eleanor hidden, their conversation became clearly audible. "I don't like this, Senator," Sullivan was saying. "Reed and your wife could be waiting to ambush us." "Former wife," Montgomery corrected coldly. "And whether it's them or some misguided ally, the outcome will be the same. We acquire the gold's location, then eliminate any complications." He patted the rifle cradled in his arm. "Permanently," Blackwood grunted in agreement. "The woman's evidence would never stand against your word in any court, Montgomery. And Reed's credibility will be easily undermined once we control the valley's economy through the railroad and mining operations." "Precisely, Watson," Montgomery replied as they moved deeper into the shaft. "Which is why this charade of negotiation is merely a formality. Once we've secured what we came for, 3 unfortunate accidents will resolve our problems quite neatly." Nathaniel glanced at Eleanor, confirming she had heard the damning exchange. She nodded slightly, her expression grim but satisfied. The men had revealed their murderous intentions clearly enough to justify whatever actions might become necessary in self-defense. "Look here," Blackwood's voice echoed from deeper within the tunnel. "Gold, actual gold flecks in the wall." Reed's grandfather wasn't exaggerating. The excitement in his tone was palpable greed, overwhelming caution, as the 3 men clustered around the first of the planted samples. Nathaniel seized the opportunity, signaling to Eleanor that it was time to implement the next phase of their plan. With practiced coordination, they moved from their hiding place to block the mine entrance. Nathaniel's revolver trained on the group, while Eleanor's imposing figure prevented any easy escape. "That's far enough, gentlemen," Nathaniel announced, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I believe we heard enough about your plans for our unfortunate accidents to justify this intervention." The 3 men whirled toward the sound, their expressions shifting from shock to calculation as they assessed the situation. Montgomery's gaze fixed on Eleanor, recognition and fury darkening his features. "Catherine," he said, using her former name like a weapon, "I should have known you lacked the courage to actually die. Always taking the coward's path, aren't you?" Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly, her posture straight and proud. "My name is Eleanor now, Charles, and there was no courage required to flee a marriage that had become a prison. Only self-preservation and the will to be free." Montgomery's laugh held no humor. "Free? You've never been free, Catherine. You've been running, hiding, living in fear of my finding you. That's not freedom, it's merely a longer leash." "Enough," Nathaniel interrupted, unwilling to let Montgomery's psychological tactics undermine Eleanor's resolve. "We're here to propose a genuine negotiation, not exchange personal grievances." Blackwood's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Negotiation? You have guns pointed at us, Doc. That's not how civilized men begin negotiations." "Perhaps not," Nathaniel acknowledged, "but when those civilized men have already discussed murdering us and seizing property through fraudulent means, certain precautions seem prudent." Sullivan, who had remained ominously silent, suddenly lunged toward a support beam, his hand reaching for something concealed there. Eleanor reacted instantly, crossing the space with surprising speed to intercept him, her strength evident as she pinned him against the tunnel wall with minimal apparent effort. "I wouldn't," she said quietly, removing a small derringer from his grasp. "Charles may consider you expendable, Mr. Sullivan. I suggest you consider whether dying for his cause is truly in your best interest." The calm control in her voice, the absence of either fear or excessive force in her actions, seemed to unnerve Sullivan more than threats might have. He went still in her grasp, calculating, eyes shifting between his companions as though reassessing his allegiances. "Now," Nathaniel continued, "let's discuss the actual situation. You want gold. We want to maintain our legitimate property rights and freedom from persecution. I believe there's a compromise that could satisfy both objectives." Montgomery's expression remained coldly furious, but Blackwood showed interest, greed momentarily overcoming his indignation at being outmaneuvered. "What kind of compromise?" he asked cautiously. "A legitimate business arrangement," Nathaniel proposed. "Mining rights granted through proper legal channels, with fair compensation and environmental protections included in the contract. No false charges, no forced sales, no unfortunate accidents." "And why would we agree to such terms when we hold the advantage of numbers and influence?" Montgomery demanded, his hand still resting ominously on his rifle. "Because," Eleanor replied calmly, "we've documented your conspiracy, including the false warrant, the deputizing of private gunmen, and your explicit statements regarding planned murders. That evidence is currently in the hands of a trusted ally with instructions to deliver it to federal authorities should anything happen to either of us." It was a calculated bluff. The documentation existed but had not yet been dispatched. However, the confidence in Eleanor's tone made it convincing, especially to men accustomed to protecting themselves through similar precautionary measures. Sullivan was the first to break his self-preservation instincts, overriding loyalty to his employers. "I was merely following orders," he protested. "The senator and Blackwood developed the plan. I was an employee carrying out their instructions." "You miserable coward!" Montgomery snarled, his composed facade cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "After everything I've done for you, done for me," Sullivan retorted, apparently deciding his position was already compromised. "You've used me to do your dirty work for years, always ensuring I'd be the one implicated if anything went wrong. I'm tired of being your scapegoat, Montgomery." The fracturing of their alliance was exactly what Nathaniel had hoped to provoke. As the men turned on each other, their accusations became increasingly specific and damning, Montgomery detailing Blackwood's intimidation of smaller ranchers, Blackwood revealing Montgomery's bribery of territorial officials, Sullivan exposing the elaborate financial scheme they had created to launder profits from the anticipated gold discovery. Each revelation was carefully noted in Nathaniel's journal, the men too absorbed in their mutual recriminations to notice his documentation of their crimes. Eleanor maintained her vigilant position, watching for any attempt to turn their verbal attacks into physical ones. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely had a new voice not interrupted from the mine entrance. "I believe I've heard enough," announced Sheriff Grant, stepping into view with Martha Wilkins and two deputies behind him. "Senator Montgomery, Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Sullivan, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted fraud, issuing false warrants, and conspiracy to commit murder." The shock on the three men's faces would have been comical under different circumstances. Montgomery recovered first, his political instincts surfacing as he attempted to reassert control. "This is absurd, Sheriff. I'm a United States Senator. You have no jurisdiction to—" "I have every jurisdiction to arrest men planning murders in my county," Grant interrupted with unexpected firmness. Your position makes your crimes worse, not excusable. He gestured to his deputies. Disarm them and secure their hands. Carefully, they're desperate men with nothing to lose now. As the deputies moved to comply, Martha approached Nathaniel and Eleanor, relief evident in her lined face. When I saw the trackers returning to town empty-handed, I knew it was time to bring the sheriff. I may have convinced him that certain documents had already been dispatched to the territorial governor, creating some urgency in his response. Nathaniel smiled at her resourcefulness. A necessary exaggeration. Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins. Your timing is impeccable. The process of securing the prisoners and escorting them from the mine proceeded with surprising smoothness, though Montgomery's cold fury as he was led past Eleanor promised that their confrontation was not truly over. Some men never accepted defeat, particularly at the hands of those they considered inferior. As the unusual procession made its way down the slope toward the waiting horses, Eleanor and Nathaniel remained slightly apart, watching the outcome of their desperate gamble with a mixture of relief and lingering wariness. It worked, Eleanor said quietly, a note of wonder in her voice. I hardly dared believe it would, but it actually worked. Thanks to you, Wetbaum, Nathaniel replied, his admiration evident. Your courage facing Montgomery, your quick action with Sullivan. Without those, we might be the ones in custody. Or worse. Eleanor shook her head, the wooden ring catching the late afternoon sunlight as she gestured dismissively. It was your plan, your understanding of how to turn their own greed and suspicion against them. We succeeded because we each contributed what the other lacked. She paused, then added softly, true partnership, as you once described it in your letters. The reference to their correspondence to the beginning of their unlikely journey together brought a warm smile to Nathaniel's face. Indeed, though I suspect neither of us anticipated quite this outcome when we first exchanged words on paper. No, Eleanor agreed, her own smile holding a hint of wonder. But perhaps it's the outcomes we don't anticipate that prove most valuable in the end. Sheriff Grant approached them before Nathaniel could respond, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and respect. Dr. Reed, Miss Grace, I owe you both an apology. I should have questioned the warrant more thoroughly, investigated Blackwood's claims rather than accepting them at face value. You were manipulated by powerful men skilled in deception, Nathaniel replied graciously. The important thing is that you acted correctly when presented with the truth. Grant nodded, clearly relieved by this generous interpretation. There will be a formal hearing, of course. Your testimony will be essential in ensuring justice is served. Montgomery has powerful friends even now. We'll be there, Eleanor assured him, with all necessary evidence. As Grant rejoined his deputies and prisoners, Martha approached once more, her practical nature reasserting itself now that the immediate danger had passed. You'll need to return to the ranch soon, she advised. Establish your presence, make it clear you're not fugitives, but rightful residents reclaiming your property after being forced into hiding by false accusations. Nathaniel nodded, the practical considerations of rebuilding their disrupted lives beginning to take shape in his mind. You're right, there will be questions, paperwork, legal matters to address. And decisions to make, Eleanor added quietly, her gaze meeting his with unspoken meaning. About the future, about arrangements. The wooden ring on her right hand seemed to carry additional weight now, its significance evolved through their shared ordeal into something more profound than either had initially intended. Nathaniel found himself wondering if it might someday migrate to her left hand, a symbol not of ownership, but of chosen partnership. Yes, he agreed softly, important decisions, but perhaps not ones that must be made immediately. Martha observed their exchange with knowing eyes, a small smile touching her lips. Well, while you're contemplating these weighty matters, I've taken the liberty of preparing a proper meal at your house, Dr. Reed. After all you've been through, you deserve something better than trail provisions and anxiety. The simple kindness brought unexpected emotion to Nathaniel's throat. Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins, for everything. As they made their way down the mountain toward home, a word that suddenly carried new meaning and possibility, Nathaniel found himself reflecting on the strange path that had led them here. An advertisement placed in desperate loneliness. Letters exchanged between strangers. Expectations upended by reality. Danger confronted together rather than fled separately. And through it all, the gradual discovery that strength came in many forms, that partnerships flourish not despite differences, but because of them, and that sometimes the most unexpected combinations prove the most resilient. Eleanor walked beside him, her long stride unconsciously adjusting to match his shorter one, her presence a reassurance rather than an imposition. The wooden ring gleamed on her hand, carrying memories of the past and promises for the future, Sarah's name preserved but no longer solitary space, waiting for new beginnings without erasing what had come before. What are you thinking? Eleanor asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Nathaniel smiled up at her, the disparity in their heights no longer seeming incongruous, but simply part of who they were together. I'm thinking that when I carved that ring, I believed I was crafting a symbol of conventional marriage, of returning to a life I had lost with Sarah. But now I understand it represents something different, something I never had before. And what is that? Eleanor prompted gently. Partnership between equals, Nathaniel replied simply. Different in nature, complementary in strengths, neither diminished by the other's capabilities. He hesitated, then added, the kind of bond I believe we've begun to forge these past weeks. Eleanor's expression softened vulnerability and hope visible beneath her usual composure. I believe so too, she said quietly. Though there remains much for us to learn about each other, many adjustments still to be made. A lifetime's worth, perhaps. Nathaniel suggested, the phrase hovering between statement and question. Eleanor's answer came not in words but in action, her hand finding his as they walked, fingers intertwining in a gesture that acknowledged both their differences and their growing connection. The wooden ring pressed gently against his skin, no longer merely a symbol of what might be, but a token of what was already becoming. Behind them, the setting sun cast their shadows across the valley floor, one tall, one shorter, moving in perfect synchronization toward a future neither had imagined when they first reached out across the distance in search of companionship. Ahead lay challenges still to be faced, decisions yet to be made, a relationship still taking shape through daily choices and shared experiences. But for now, this moment of connection was enough, two souls finding in each other not what they had expected, but what they truly needed. Different, yet harmonious, separate, yet united, their unlikely bond growing stronger with each step toward home. In Willow Creek Valley, as evening shadows lengthened across the land, a new chapter was beginning, not just for Nathaniel and Eleanor, but for the community that would witness their unconventional partnership and perhaps learn from it that true strength often came in unexpected forms, and that the most enduring connections were those that honored difference rather than demanding conformity. The wooden ring caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like a promise, kept like possibility, embraced like hope renewed after long absence. And in that simple token, carved with care and worn with choice, resided the essence of what they were becoming together, something neither could have created alone, something beautiful in its uniqueness, something built to endure.